Tonight we drift back, not just a little way, not to the cozy eras of powdered wigs or candlelit parlors. No, we step further, down through centuries, peeling back the fragile layers of history until marble rises where glass towers stand, and the streets ring not with car horns, but the sandals of thousands. Tonight we are in Rome, not the Rome of holiday postcards or glossy documentaries narrated with swelling music. No polished Colosseum with perfect arches. Not the Rome you imagine while eating a plate of spaghetti, which, by the way, the Romans would not have recognized. No tomatoes, no pasta, no espresso. Forget it. The Rome you step into is louder, smellier, and much less cinematic. But it is alive, and it is waiting for you. You who live in a world of running water, electric lights, central heating, and Amazon deliveries. You would not last a day in the Roman Empire. Not because of the swords, though those are real enough. Not because of the politics, though knives in the Senate are not entirely metaphorical. You wouldn't last because Rome is a world designed for Romans, and you, soft, modern, perhaps with your favorite pillow waiting just across the room, are not built for it. But tonight, you don't need to last. You only need to walk with me, slowly, gently, as though we are strolling through the flicker of a dream. You don't have to fight the wars, or drink the sour wine, or breathe too deeply in the crowded streets. You only have to listen, while outside your window, the modern night hums in its quiet electricity, and here, by this imagined fire, Rome rises again. Let us begin with a city. Rome, the capital of an empire that swallowed the known world. In its peak, perhaps 1 million people packed into it. The largest city on Earth. To us, that sounds like marvel. To them, it sounded like noise. Imagine, if you can, 1 million lives pressed into tight streets, each chasing bread, work, or survival. Imagine waking not to silence, but to the clatter of carts on cobblestones, the shouts of sellers, the laughter, the arguments, the barking of dogs, the braying of donkeys. A symphony of humanity, in all its glory and filth. The houses are not marble palaces. Those were for senators and emperors, perhaps for poets who had lucked into patronage. You would most likely find yourself in an insula, a tall, rickety apartment block of wood and brick, 5, 6, even 7 stories stacked upward, leaning slightly, always on the verge of collapse. Fires were constant, roofs leaked, and inside, in your one-room space, a family of 5 might be sleeping, pressed close together with straw mattresses and little else. Cozy, perhaps, if you are falling asleep, but claustrophobic if you wake in the middle of the night. And yet, Rome was proud of itself. They believed they had brought order to chaos, roads to wilderness, and law to the lawless. Pax Romana, they called it, the Roman peace. A peace held together by legions, spears, and crucifixions. It is the kind of peace you don't argue with. This is where you find yourself tonight. Not as an emperor, not as a senator striding into marble halls, not even as a general returning from conquest. You are an ordinary soul, one of many. You rise when the city stirs, and you sleep when the lamps fade. You fetch your water from the public fountain because plumbing, though Romans invented it, was mostly for the wealthy. You eat bread dipped in watered wine, maybe with a scrap of cheese if fortune is kind. And if you are thinking, surely the grandeur of Rome must make up for the hardships, let us look closer. Rome is grand, yes. The Colosseum rises like a stone crown on the city. The aqueducts march across valleys with impossible grace. Temples glisten, arches stretch high, statues of marble and bronze glare with stern dignity. Rome has dressed itself to impress, but beneath the marble there is always mud. Beneath the statues, slaves stand in shadow. Beneath the temples, fires burn sacrifices that fill the air with smoke. It is, in short, a contradiction. One moment you are stepping on polished marble. The next, you are dodging something unpleasant tossed from an upstairs window. Still, there is beauty. The evening in Rome is thick with lamps glowing behind shutters, the smell of baking bread drifting from a stall, the soft murmur of people lingering in courtyards. Somewhere, a flute plays, thin and reedy, half swallowed by the night. And over it all, the Roman sky, wide, endless, the same sky you know, but ancient, untamed by streetlights. Stars glimmer coldly, watching a city that believes itself eternal. And you, modern guest, are tired. Already the walk through this imagined city weighs on you. The air is heavier, the ground harder beneath your sandals. You can feel why you would not last a day here. But for tonight, that is not the point. Tonight, Rome is a story you can drift into, safe in your bed, far from the smells and the noise, close only to the slow rhythm of words, carrying you gently further into the past. You will hear of emperors and battles, of strange foods and stranger medicines, of gods and omens, of victories carved into stone, and tragedies whispered through the alleys. You will hear the truth that Rome was never just marble and glory, but mud and blood and bread and dreams. And if, somewhere between those words, your eyes close, and the fire we imagine here sinks low, then Rome has done what it must. It has lulled you into history's sleep. So lie back, listen, and walk with me into the empire. For the night is long, the empire vast, and your bed far softer than any Roman ever knew. Morning in Rome does not arrive quietly. It is not a gentle symphony of alarm clocks set to calming tones, nor is it the subtle glow of blackout curtains letting in just enough sunlight to wake you slowly. Instead, imagine this: a street filled with donkeys braying, vendors shouting their wares at dawn, roosters crowing from every rooftop, and the sound of a neighbor's wooden shutters banging open. There is no snooze button. The city itself shakes you awake. If you are lucky, your insula, your apartment block, is still standing. Fires often tore through the tightly packed neighborhoods, so the mere fact that your walls have not collapsed in the night is worth a grateful sigh. You wake up stiff from a straw mattress, possibly sharing it with family members, since space is too precious for luxuries like privacy. No pillows embroidered with soft feathers. No linen sheets freshly laundered with lavender. Instead, wool blankets, scratchy and heavy, which smell faintly of smoke from the oil lamps that burned last night. You stir and you feel the dust. Rome is full of dust, carried in from the streets, stirred up by cart wheels, drifting in from the open windows. It sticks to your skin. It gets under your nails. You wake not refreshed, but coated. And the air, well, the air carries the smell of yesterday. Smoke, sewage, 1,000 dinners cooked on open fires, all still clinging faintly. If you have ever thought of Rome as marble white and fragrant, morning reminds you that it is much closer to mud and ash. But you are awake now. What comes next? The first task of the day is light. Candles if you are wealthy, oil lamps if you are not. Or perhaps you skip it altogether and stumble around in the half-dark until the sun rises properly. Roman mornings are busy, but they are not bright. Artificial light is expensive. Even olive oil, though abundant, is not free. And so the Romans live with the shadows. Water is next. You cannot simply twist a faucet. You must go outside, jug in hand, and fetch it from a public fountain. Rome's aqueducts are a marvel of engineering, yes, arches stretching across the countryside, bringing fresh water from miles away. But unless you live in a grand house, the aqueduct does not deliver directly to your kitchen. You share. Everyone shares, which means waiting in line, dipping your jug, and carrying it back upstairs. A chore performed daily with aching arms. And if you are thinking, at least the water is clean, the answer is, sometimes. Rome's water was better than most ancient cities, fresher, flowing, even cool in summer. But lead pipes, sewage, and sheer overcrowding meant purity was never guaranteed. Still, it was good enough to drink, good enough to bathe, and certainly good enough to pour over your hands and face as you prepare for the day. Now to the body. Romans valued cleanliness, but not in the way you imagine. Morning showers? Unthinkable. Soap, as you know it, did not exist. Instead, Romans used oil. They rubbed olive oil into their skin, and then scraped it off with a curved tool called a strigil. Off came the oil, and with it, the dirt. Efficient, perhaps, but not exactly refreshing. Imagine standing there, groggy, smearing yourself with oil, then dragging a bronze blade across your arms and legs until you felt vaguely less sticky. Your hair? Little more than water and fingers, unless you were wealthy enough to afford combs and slaves to arrange it. Your teeth? A rinse with water, maybe a chew on a stick. Toothpaste was a mixture of crushed bones and oyster shells. Yes, really. If you are imagining minty freshness, you are in the wrong millennium. Now dressed, not in trousers, not in shirts. Those were barbarian garments. You pull over your tunic, simple, knee-length, made of wool. Plain if you are poor, dyed if you can afford it. No buttons, no zippers, no fast fashion. Just a single piece of fabric belted at the waist. And if you are feeling particularly Roman, perhaps you wrap yourself in a toga. But beware, the toga is not comfortable. It is heavy, cumbersome, and requires practice to drape correctly. Most people avoided it unless required for ceremony. In reality, your day begins not with elegance, but with a practical tunic and sandals strapped to your feet. Breakfast awaits, though calling it breakfast might be too generous. The Romans did not believe in lavish morning meals. A piece of bread, maybe dipped in wine or spread with cheese if fortune smiles on you. Some olives, a fig, perhaps leftovers from last night. That is it. No eggs and bacon. No steaming coffee. Coffee, in fact, would not be discovered for another 1500 years. Imagine beginning your day without caffeine. That alone is reason enough you would not last in Rome. Still, you chew the bread. It is dense, dark, often coarse with grit from the millstones. Romans' teeth were famously worn down, not from sugar, but from tiny stones that slipped into their flour. Every bite, over the years, filed their teeth away. Breakfast is therefore not indulgence, but survival. A small bite to carry you into the morning. And now out into the streets. You step outside your insula, blinking in the early light, and Rome greets you not with silence, but with chaos. Already, carts rattle past, though technically, carts were forbidden within the city during daytime. Rules were one thing, reality was another. Vendors shout, children run, dogs bark, soldiers march, and somewhere, a philosopher argues loudly on a street corner about the meaning of virtue. Rome does not ease into the day. It erupts into it. If you are wealthy, your morning begins at home, attended by slaves, perhaps dictating letters or reading reports. You may stroll to the forum, dressed in your toga, ready to shake hands, exchange favors, and complain about politics. If you are poor, you begin by finding work. A laborer waits in the marketplace for someone to hire him. A craftsman opens his shop. A woman sets out her basket of goods to sell. Survival requires movement. There is no quiet meditation, no leisurely coffee scroll on a glowing screen. There is simply life, immediate and demanding. Yet, in its own way, the Roman morning carries rhythm. The city, noisy as it is, beats like a heart. It has no electricity, no engines, no skyscrapers, but it has pulse and it draws you in. The shouts and smells and footsteps weave together into a pattern that is strangely comforting if you surrender to it. You may not last a day here, but for one morning, drifting in the half-dream of history, you can walk its streets without fear, knowing you will return to your bed, your softness, your silence. And so, the morning passes. Rome is awake, and so are you. By now, the Roman morning has shaken itself fully awake. The city hums, groans, and clatters with the rhythm of thousands of feet, hooves, and cartwheels. If mornings are the stretch of a great animal, then midday is the beast in motion. And its beating heart? The marketplace. The Roman Forum was not a marketplace in the way you might imagine a modern shopping district. It was more than rows of stalls. It was a blend of politics, business, religion, and gossip, all pressed together in one great square, echoing with marble colonnades and shouted bargains. To walk into it was to step into the bloodstream of Rome itself. But let us step carefully, for the ground beneath our sandals is not polished. Rome was many things, powerful, inventive, relentless, but it was not particularly clean. Garbage lingered where carts had spilled it, animal droppings dotted the cobblestones, and the air swirled with a mix of frying food, sweat, perfume, and smoke. The glorious empire was, in truth, gloriously pungent. Still, the marketplace was alive with energy. Imagine the stalls. Rough wooden tables propped up with baskets overflowing with figs, olives, grapes, and dates. Mountains of bread, their crusts dark and hard, piled in stacks. Fish glistening on slabs of stone, brought in from the Mediterranean only hours ago, already buzzing with flies. Butchers hacking cuts of goat or pork with cleavers that rang like bells against the blocks. Everywhere, voices, bargaining, shouting, laughing, complaining. There are sellers of garlands, their fingers stained green from weaving leaves and flowers. Sellers of pottery, each clay bowl slightly uneven, stacked high in precarious towers. Sellers of cheap jewelry, gleaming bronze rings, and tiny glass beads meant to shimmer like gemstones in the sun. If you are wealthy, you browse with your slave carrying the purchases. If you are poor, you handle the goods yourself, weighing every coin carefully, knowing it must stretch further than you would like. And coins themselves tell a story. Small, heavy, stamped with emperors' faces, some recent, some worn down by decades of trade. Every exchange is not just money passing hands, but history itself, sliding from palm to palm. A single denarius might once have belonged to a soldier on campaign in Gaul, then to a merchant in Alexandria, then to a fisherman in Naples, before finally ending up in your pouch. Rome's economy was as vast and restless as the empire itself. But But the market is not only for food and trinkets. Here too you find services. Need a haircut? A barber is ready with his shears, though you might get more gossip than grooming. Need legal advice? A scribe sits with wax tablets, ready to draft letters, petitions, or contracts for a fee. Need entertainment? A street performer juggles, sings, or balances precariously on stilts while a crowd tosses him a few coins. Religion is present too, always watching. Shrines dot the marketplace, small altars to household gods or mighty Jupiter himself. Offer a coin, a flower, a drop of wine, and hope the divine eyes glance favorably at you. Rome, for all its pride, never took chances with the gods. Every deal, every bargain, every loaf of bread was somehow tied to divine favor. And of course, the marketplace is where politics thrives. Senators stroll, trailed by their clients, men who bow and flatter in exchange for favors. News spreads here faster than in scrolls or letters. The emperor's decrees, the rumors of war, the whisper that a neighbor was caught cheating his taxes, all carried by tongues looser than amphora lids. Rome is a city where gossip is both entertainment and weapon. Now, let us step aside and watch the daily life swirl. You see the baker's apprentice, white with flour, darting through the crowd. You see women balancing baskets of vegetables on their heads, their children trailing behind like ducklings. You see beggars crouched against walls, hands outstretched, eyes hollow. You see soldiers in armor, their sandals clattering, their presence a reminder that order here is enforced not by kindness but by steel. And beyond the market, daily life stretches outward like veins. Workshops ring with the clang of hammers. Leather workers scrape hides smooth. Blacksmiths stoke their fires until sparks leap, shaping nails, hinges, and blades. Cobblers stitch sandals. Painters smear walls with fresh colors for advertisements or political slogans. Rome was a city that built, repaired, and sold without pause. Yet not all work is labor. There are schools too, though not as you picture them. No desks in neat rows, no chalkboards. Instead, a handful of boys, and rarely girls, gathered around a teacher in a rented room or even under a shaded portico, scratching letters onto wax tablets with styluses. The lesson? Memorization. Endless memorization. To be Roman and educated was to recite endlessly, to know not only your letters but your poets, to repeat Virgil until the words became almost a lullaby. Meanwhile, in homes scattered through the city, women tend the household, spinning wool, preparing meals, managing slaves if they are wealthy, or doing everything by hand if they are not. Children play with dolls, carved from wood, or small clay animals. Boys toss nuts as dice. Girls learn to weave. Life is practical, immediate. There are no idle hours spent staring at glowing screens. Every moment is used either for survival, work, or ritual. Still, amidst all this noise and motion, there is a rhythm that carries its own peace. You cannot imagine living it because you measure life differently, in hours, in schedules, in to-do lists. A Roman measured life in meals, in festivals, in seasons. The morning market, the midday pause, the evening wine, the year broken by rituals, Saturnalia, harvest feasts, the emperor's games. And though their streets were loud, their water heavy to carry, their bread hard to chew, still they moved with a kind of acceptance. By midday, the heat presses down. Rome's sun is merciless in summer, glaring off marble and clay alike. People retreat indoors, shutters closed, or seek shade under colonnades. Work slows. The marketplace, once loud, softens. Rome breathes even if briefly, and you, drifting through its dust and chatter, may finally feel the strange calm of its heartbeat. Rome was not a city designed for comfort. It was designed for survival, ambition, and spectacle. Yet, in the marketplace, you see it most clearly. Humanity in all its forms, bargaining, laughing, struggling, and enduring. If the morning belonged to survival, then the marketplace belonged to living raw, noisy, unfiltered. And so, the day stretches on. By the time the sun hangs directly overhead, Rome feels like a furnace. The city is a place of stone and dust, and both hold the heat as though the empire itself were a kiln, baking its people inside. The market slows, hammers fall quiet, even the chatter fades to murmurs. Noon in Rome was not a time for ambition. It was a time for food, and for surrendering, however briefly, to rest. Romans divided their day with the same practicality they divided their empire. Morning was for business and bargaining, midday for eating and pausing, evening for leisure or spectacle. Lunch, or prandium, was never the grand meal of the day. That honor belonged to dinner, the cena. But still, this midday moment held its own kind of ritual, a small act of survival against the weight of heat and hunger. For the poor, prandium was as plain as survival allowed. A piece of bread, dipped in olive oil, maybe paired with cheese or a handful of dates if fortune was kind. Some might have cold leftovers from the night before, a scrap of fish, a slice of salted pork, the remains of a stew. It was fuel, nothing more. And yet, even in its simplicity, this meal carried the flavors of empire. Bread made from Egyptian grain, olives grown in Spain, salted fish caught in the waters of distant Greece. To eat in Rome was to taste conquest without ever leaving the city. For the middling classes, lunch could be something a little richer, lentils stewed with onions, bread sprinkled with herbs, figs stuffed with nuts. And if you were truly fortunate, perhaps a slice of garum-seasoned meat. Garum, that pungent Roman fish sauce, poured into everything with the confidence of a civilization that believed rot equaled flavor. One whiff was enough to divide opinion sharply. Either you adored it, or you pretended you did, because to dislike garum was to declare yourself outside Roman taste itself. The wealthy, of course, treated even the midday meal as another chance to display abundance. Slaves might bring platters of oysters, cold chicken, spiced sausages, or honey cakes. But even here, the true indulgence was not the food itself but the idleness, the luxury of eating slowly, reclining in the shade, while others worked in the heat. Lunch was not about hunger but about status. To linger was to announce that you owned the hours, rather than being owned by them. And yet, across all classes, what followed lunch was often the same: stillness. The Romans had a word for it, meridiatio, a midday rest. Some historians call it a nap, but it was more than that. It was an admission that the human body, however disciplined or ambitious, was not meant to wrestle with the full force of the Mediterranean sun. Even senators, even generals, even emperors themselves, all were reduced by noon to men closing their eyes, surrendering for a time to silence. Picture it, the city that just hours ago roared with trade and clamor now dozing. Shutters drawn against the heat, workshops quiet, streets emptier than you'd expect, a stray dog slinking into a shaded corner. Even the fountains, once crowded with buckets and chatter, now flowing with little company. Rome did not sleep, exactly, but it softened. It became, for one suspended hour, less an empire and more a village again. Of course, not everyone could afford this pause. Slaves continued their duties, fetching water, grinding grain, tending animals, cleaning the endless dust from villas. Laborers might snatch only a few stolen minutes under the shade of a wall before returning to work. But even then, the rhythm of the city shifted. The urgency drained, the heat insisted, the body demanded, and Rome obeyed. This midday pause also carved space for reflection. For some, it was prayer, a small offering at a household shrine. For others, it was conversation with family, or quiet gossip with a neighbor over the thin wall of an insula apartment. For many, it was simply lying still, eyes half closed, listening to the faint hum of the city around them. Sleep, or half sleep, or the gentle drifting thoughts that come when the body surrenders but the mind lingers in its own corridors. It is worth noting, too, that Romans did not divide their night and day as we do. They were not creatures of electric light. Their lives followed the sun, and the idea of one long, unbroken night's sleep was foreign. Instead, sleep came in segments, a stretch after sunset, pause at midnight, a doze after noon. Their rest was scattered like pieces of mosaic, fitted around the demands of light, fire, and work. The siesta was not indulgence, it was survival. And in this pause, Rome was at its most human. Not conquering, not boasting, not draped in triumphal arches or roaring in amphitheaters. Just breathing, just lying in the shade, just admitting that empire or not, no one outruns the sun. If you wander through a wealthy villa at this hour, you find shutters pulled tight, creating pools of dim light. The air smells faintly of olive oil lamps, though they are not yet lit. A slave might fan their master as he reclines, half asleep, muttering through dreams of accounts or victories. Children doze on mats. The household quiets like a great beast curling inward. If you wander instead through the cramped insulae, the apartment blocks of the poor, you see families huddled in the single bit of shade their narrow windows allow. A mother with a baby at her breast, nodding into shallow sleep. An old man leaning against the wall, eyes closed but not entirely trusting the silence. A boy curled on the floor beside his father, stomach still half empty from a meal too small. Even here, rest insists on being taken, however imperfectly. By the time the sun tilts westward, Rome begins to stir again. The shutters open, The workshops creak back into sound. The market sellers return to their stalls, their voices shaking the air awake. The fountains grow crowded again with buckets and chatter. Rome stretches from its midday pause and resumes its restless pulse. The siesta is forgotten as quickly as it was embraced, like a dream upon waking. But its presence shaped the rhythm of Roman life as much as any law, any army, any emperor's decree. The empire conquered vast lands, yes, but it could not conquer the human need for stillness. At noon, Rome learned humility, though it would never have admitted it. And so the city, revived, moves forward into the evening. Hunger grows, shadows lengthen, and another meal, far grander than lunch, awaits. If lunch in Rome was practical, then dinner, the cena, was theater. It was the great stage upon which appetite, wealth, and status all performed their roles. As the sun began to sink and the heat of the day finally loosened its grip, Romans turned inward, into their homes, their courtyards, their dining rooms. The meal that followed was not just food. It was spectacle, ritual, and sometimes even survival. For the poor, cena was simple, little more than an extension of the day's scraps. A pot of porridge, perhaps thickened with beans or lentils, flavored faintly with whatever herbs or oil could be spared. Bread again, always bread, the foundation of existence, baked from the endless shipments of grain arriving by ship from Egypt. Sometimes a bit of fish or dried meat, sometimes just vegetables, onions, leeks, or cabbage boiled into something filling if not exactly exciting. For the majority of Rome's people, dinner was not a performance but a necessity, a way to fill the belly before darkness set in. But as you climbed the ladder of wealth, the meal transformed. For the middle classes, cena might mean roasted chicken, a handful of olives, fresh figs, cheese from the countryside, wine diluted with water. It was not abundance, but it was comfort. The kind of meal that made the day feel complete, that wrapped labor in a cloak of satisfaction. Then, at the very top, came the banquets. To dine with the wealthy was to step into a world that blurred the line between hunger and theater, between nourishment and exhibition. Reclining on couches, for the Romans believed sitting upright was too pedestrian. The elite arranged themselves around low tables. Their guests did the same, lying sideways, propped on one elbow, their other hand free to pluck morsels from dishes brought forward by slaves. Imagine the scene. The flicker of oil lamps on polished marble, the cool splash of a fountain in the atrium, the murmur of conversation weaving together with the sound of music. Platters are carried in, roasted peacocks with their feathers reattached purely for spectacle, dormice stuffed with minced pork and honey, sausages spiced with pepper imported from India. Each dish was less about taste than about astonishment, a reminder to every guest of the reach of empire. Here was a feast made possible only by conquest. Dates from Africa, oysters from Britain, wine from Gaul, spices from the East. To eat was to consume the world itself. Wine flowed freely, though always cut with water, for to drink it pure was considered barbaric. The wealthy had elaborate systems of mixing, cooling, and spicing their wines, honey for sweetness, herbs for sharpness, sometimes even seawater for salt. Goblets were lifted, toasts offered, and the air grew looser, warmer, more indulgent as the evening carried on. Yet the true ritual of cena was not in the food or drink alone, but in the structure of the meal. It was divided into courses, the gustatio or appetizers, eggs, salads, small bites to stir appetite. Then the prima mensa, the main courses, meats, fish, stews, the heart of the feast. Finally, the secunda mensa, desserts, fruit, nuts, cakes soaked in honey. A Roman banquet unfolded like a play, with rising action, climax, and gentle conclusion. Conversation was as important as the dishes themselves. Guests discussed politics, poetry, philosophy. They recited verses, told jokes, debated ideas. Sometimes professional entertainers were hired, musicians, dancers, even acrobats, to break the lull between courses. In the homes of the truly ambitious, dinner became a political act. Whom you invited, where they reclined, what dishes were served. All signaled alliances and rivalries. A man's dining room could be as dangerous as the Senate. And yet, beneath all this grandeur, there was also indulgence of a different kind. Romans, especially the wealthy, were notorious for overeating. So much so that historians tell us of the infamous vomitorium, not, as is often imagined, a special room for purging during banquets, but a misunderstanding of the term used to describe stadium exits. Still, the legend survives because it fits. Romans did, indeed, gorge themselves to excess, and some may have excused themselves discreetly to make room for more. To recline and to consume until the body could take no more. this was not considered shameful. It was considered proof that fortune had smiled upon you. But there was also tenderness in dinner, families gathering around a shared pot, children gnawing on crusts of bread, a husband and wife splitting a fig at the end of the meal, its sweetness a small luxury against the roughness of the day. Even in the poorest corners of the city, even in the cramped insulae, Cena was a moment of pause, of togetherness. A moment to sit, however briefly, in the comfort of survival. Night fell quickly in Rome. Oil lamps cast soft pools of light across the triclinium, the dining room. Shadows deepened, voices grew softer. The heat of the day gave way to cooler air. And as the last bites of fruit were taken, as the final goblets of watered wine were drained, the meal gave way to restfulness. For the poor, it meant sleep soon after, the day's labor done. For the wealthy, it meant lingering, stretching the evening with conversation, laughter, and perhaps more wine. Some dined until midnight, their voices echoing faintly into the streets outside. Yet in every home, the ritual of dinner marked a transition. From labor to leisure, from light to dark, from the demands of empire to the private spaces of family, friendship, and rest. The meal was not just food, it was the rhythm of life itself. Think of the city at this hour, thousands of lamps flickering behind shutters, families gathered close, voices humming faintly. The empire might boast of its armies, its monuments, its laws carved in stone. But here, in these small rooms, the empire lived most truly. In bread broken, in wine poured, in the warmth of company against the fall of night. And then, gradually, the city softened. The lamps burned lower, the voices faded, the guests departed, leaving only the scrape of sandals in the street. The wealthy lay back on their couches, the poor on their straw mats. And Rome, still restless, still vast, still awake in its corners, began once more to edge toward sleep. Dinner had ended, the night stretched ahead, and though the empire prided itself on conquest, what its people most longed for now was simple rest. If dinner was the empire's stage for appetite, then the bathhouse was its sanctuary for the body and spirit. The Romans were, above all else, a people of ritual, and among their rituals, none was more beloved, more defining, or more persistently woven into daily life than the act of bathing. Imagine the city in late afternoon. The day's dust hangs heavy in the air, stirred by hooves and sandals alike. Smoke from cook fires drifts lazily upward, and across the streets, toward domes of brick and marble, the people flow, men and women, slaves and senators, the wealthy and the poor. Their destinations are the same, the public baths or thermae, vast complexes where water, heat, and leisure were offered not just as luxury but as necessity. To us, a bath might mean solitude, a quiet tub filled in the privacy of a home. But for the Romans, bathing was anything but private. It was communal, civic, woven into the very fabric of their identity. These were not simple wash houses. They were monuments to cleanliness, yes, but also to conversation, exercise, gossip, business, and philosophy. To skip the bath was to step outside the rhythm of Roman life itself. The ritual began at the entrance. Citizens paid a small fee, sometimes only a copper coin, while the wealthy might have slaves to handle every detail. Inside, the visitor might first step into the palestra, the open courtyard for exercise. Here men wrestled, stretched, threw the discus. Dust clung to their skin, sweat dripped from their brows. But this was all part of the process. One dirted the body in order to savor the cleansing to come. From there, the path wound inward. The apoditerium, the changing room, where clothes were stripped and placed under the watchful eye of attendants. Theft was not unheard of, and so slaves guarded the garments while their masters moved further into the ritual. Nakedness here was ordinary, unremarkable. To be Roman was to be part of a collective body, exposed and unashamed within the embrace of the bathhouse. Then came the heat, the tepidarium first, a warm room, gently heated, designed to ease the body into comfort. The air was moist, perfumed faintly by oil lamps. Here one lingered, adjusting slowly, preparing. Conversations drifted, laughter echoed, the sound of dripping water filled the chamber. The warmth loosened muscles, quieted the edges of thought. From there into the caldarium, the hot room, the true furnace of the bathhouse. Beneath the floor, the hypocaust, a genius of Roman engineering, circulated heat from blazing furnaces, warming the stone slabs until they seemed to glow with life. Steam rose from great basins of water. The air was thick, pressing against the lungs, seeping into the bones. Here, men sat in silence or in murmured talk, sweat dripping from every pore. Some massaged themselves with oils. Others let attendants scrape their skin with strigils, curved bronze tools that lifted away sweat and grime in glistening strokes. The act was both cleansing and intimate, to scrape away the day, to feel the body remade. At last, the plunge. The frigidarium, the cold pool. Its waters shocked the skin, stole the breath, reawakened every nerve dulled by heat. Men dove beneath the surface, emerging with gasps, laughter, shouts. The cold was not merely refreshing. It was believed to restore health, to balance the humors, to harden the body after the softness of steam. To skip the cold plunge was to deny the ritual its proper ending. Around these chambers stretched corridors, libraries, gardens, even lecture halls. The great bathhouses of Rome were not just for washing but for living. One might spend hours there, moving from exercise to heat to cold, pausing to read a scroll, to listen to a philosopher speak, to negotiate a contract in whispers beside a fountain. Business was transacted, friendships forged, romances hinted at. In the baths, every Roman was both citizen and body, part of a collective tide of steam and conversation. The wealthy might retreat afterward to private baths within their homes, smaller but no less ritualized. Yet even the humblest citizen could find space within the grand public halls. The baths were, in their way, democratic. Rich and poor might sweat beneath the same domes, might plunge into the same pools. Not equal, not truly, but at least in the wash of water the boundaries softened. There were, of course, critics. Some moralists complained that the baths bred decadence, that too much time was wasted in steaming chambers while virtue withered outside. Others whispered of impropriety, of encounters better left unnamed. Yet the baths endured century after century because they were more than indulgence. They were identity. To be Roman was to bathe. Think now of the sensation. The day's dust gone, skin slick with oil, pores open and refreshed, muscles softened by warmth, mind quieted by ritual. Emerging from the bathhouse at dusk, the air cool against the skin, the city suddenly brighter, cleaner, sharper. To walk home after bathing was to carry within oneself a peace of calm, a sense of balance, as though one had been remade from the inside out. And then the night, after dinner, after the bath, the city drifted toward darkness. Lamps lit the streets, voices hummed low, and across Rome, bodies reclined upon beds, clean, fed, eased into rest. The baths had washed not only skin but spirit, leaving behind a quiet readiness for sleep. So it was every day for century after century. Rome marched, conquered, legislated, argued, but always it bathed. And in the steam of the caldarium, in the chill of the frigidarium, in the murmurs that echoed against marble walls, the empire found a rhythm of care that carried its people from labor to leisure, from grime to cleanliness, from wakefulness to sleep. The water cooled, the lamps dimmed, the voices faded, and Rome, even in its vastness, exhaled. The Romans liked to say that all roads lead to Rome. It was not just a proverb, but a literal truth woven into stone and earth. Across valleys and mountains, through marshes and deserts, they laid out lines so straight they seemed drawn with a divine compass. Roads that carried armies, merchants, messengers, pilgrims, lovers, and thieves. Roads that bound together an empire stretching from the mist of Britannia to the sands of Arabia. But imagine one of these roads, not in abstraction, but beneath your feet. The morning sun glints upon slabs of stone, smooth from centuries of sandals and hooves. Dust clings to your skin, stirred by wagons groaning under their loads. On either side, mile markers rise like sentinels, each one carved to remind you of the distance traveled and the authority that ordered it. The road is not only a path, it is a declaration. Rome was here, Rome will remain. To build such marvels required genius and labor. Roman engineers did not simply flatten earth and call it done. They layered their roads with a precision that rivaled architecture itself. At the base, great stones, heavy and unyielding. Above them, smaller rocks, gravel, sand, each layer pressed, each chosen for strength. Finally, paving stones fitted together so tightly that weeds could scarcely find a home. Water drained to the sides, ensuring that rain and time would not erode the path. 2,000 years later, some of these roads still lie waiting, solid, stubborn against the centuries. For the soldier, the road was lifeblood. Armies could march faster than any foe expected, covering 20 miles in a day without faltering. A rebellion might flare in the provinces, only to find Roman troops appearing with uncanny swiftness, summoned by the invisible veins of stone that tied the empire together. For the merchant, too, the road was fortune. Wine from Gaul, olives from Hispania, spices from the east, all traveled across these arteries, feeding markets, filling purses, enriching the city at the empire's heart. But the road was also for the traveler, the pilgrim, the wanderer who sought something beyond their village horizon. Inns dotted the paths, offering straw beds and rough meals. Mansions, official way stations, provided fresh horses for couriers carrying the emperor's messages. One could journey from Rome to the farthest frontier, never leaving the empire's hand. Each step marked by the same slabs, the same milestones, the same reassurance that civilization stretched as far as the eye could see. And yet, there was something almost hypnotic about them. To walk a Roman road at dusk, with the horizon painted gold, was to feel caught between worlds. The stones held the heat of the day, warming your soles, while cool night air pressed in from the fields. The sound of your footsteps echoed softly, joined by the occasional creak of a wagon, the snort of a mule, the chatter of strangers passing by. A road was not silent, it was alive, humming with the countless lives it carried. Even the straightness of these roads was deliberate. Where others might have bent paths to suit hills and streams, Romans preferred to cut through, to tame the land. Bridges spanned rivers, causeways rose across marshes, tunnels pierced mountain. It was as if the earth itself had been persuaded to yield. To walk such a road was to walk upon Rome's willpower made visible, a line of stone insisting that no obstacle was too great. Still, not all was glory. The road could be cruel. Bandits lurked in lonely stretches, waiting for merchants too careless or too tired. Soldiers might seize your cart for imperial use, offering little in return. And for slaves, forced to march in chains, the road was no path to freedom but to yet another market, another master. Roads carried prosperity, yes, but they also carried sorrow. Every stone held echoes of triumph and despair alike. Think, for a moment, of the Appian Way, the queen of Roman roads. Laid out in the 4th century BCE, it stretched southward from Rome, a ribbon of stone through the countryside. Along it marched legions, triumphant and grim. Along it came traders, their carts rattling with goods. Along it, too, in darker days, were displayed crucified rebels, their bodies lining the road in grim warning. To walk the Appian Way was to walk within history itself, surrounded by the memories of victory and violence alike. And yet, by evening, even the busiest road quieted. The wagons ceased, the soldiers made camp, and the last rays of sun slipped behind the hills. Then the stones lay bare beneath the stars, pale in moonlight, stretching onward into the dark. The road became less a path of empire and more a whisper of eternity, a reminder that time passes, footsteps fade, but the stones endure. For Rome, the roads were more than engineering. They were identity. They declared order where once was wilderness, connection where once was isolation. They made the empire not just vast but tangible, a single body whose veins carried lifeblood from heart to limb. And for the traveler, weary from dust and distance, they offered something even simpler, the knowledge that no matter how far you wandered, the path, inevitably, would carry you home. So, as you imagine yourself upon one of these ancient stones, under the quiet hush of twilight, let the thought of the road become like a lullaby, straight, steady, unbroken, leading you gently onward, mile after mile, until at last the only journey left is the one that drifts inward, into the stillness of sleep. In the heart of Rome, rising from stone like a memory that refuses to fade, stands the Colosseum. Even in ruin, it is immense, a ring of arches stacked upon arches, its skeleton still proud after nearly 2,000 years. Today, it is a monument, silent except for the voices of tourists and the call of pigeons. But once it thundered. Once it was alive with the sound of crowds so vast they shook the very air. The Colosseum was not built for sleep, nor for peace. It was built for spectacle, for the ancient craving to witness power displayed as theater. When it opened under Emperor Titus in the year 80, it was hailed as a gift to the people, an arena large enough to seat over 50,000 souls, each one granted a view of the stage below. The stage itself was the world inverted, sand-covering wooden planks, beneath which tunnels and cages hid the machinery of death. Imagine, for a moment, approaching it as a Roman citizen. The morning sun catches its travertine stone, gleaming white against the sky. Vendors line the streets, hawking bread and wine, the city alive with anticipation. You pass through one of the great arches, one of 80, each marked for orderly entry, and step into a space that seems to widen endlessly. The roar of thousands swells, the hum of excitement like the sea before a storm. You find your seat, for every class has its place. Senators closest to the action, plebeians farther away, women and the poor in the highest tiers. From above, the emperor himself gazes down, a figure draped in purple, master of ceremonies in a theater of life and death. Then the crowd quiets, trumpets blare. The games begin. At first, processions, parades of wealth, animals led from distant provinces, exotic as dreams, lions from Africa, elephants from India, leopards, ostriches, bears, even crocodiles. They are displayed not just as creatures but as trophies, proof that Rome's reach extended into every corner of the earth. The people gasp, point, laugh, and then, almost casually, those animals are loosed against one another, or against hunters trained to dispatch them. The sand grows red. The crowd cheers. The Colosseum was not built for kindness. Its spectacles were designed to shock, to dazzle, to remind every citizen of Rome's dominion, not only over men but over nature itself. And yet, there was artistry here too. The gladiators, condemned men and trained fighters alike, entered the arena with a choreography of violence. Steel glinted, shields clashed, bodies moved with rhythm and precision. For many in the audience, it was not cruelty but drama, a living play where the stakes were nothing less than life itself. It is easy to condemn from the safety of centuries, to shake our heads at a society that found joy in blood. But to the Romans, these games carried meaning. They honored the gods, appeased restless citizens, reminded all of the emperor's generosity. Bread and circuses, the poet Juvenal wrote, were enough to keep the masses content. And so long as the amphitheater echoed with applause, Rome itself seemed eternal. Still, not all contests ended in death. Gladiators were expensive, after all, and crowds often demanded mercy for a fighter who showed courage. With a gesture, a thumb raised or turned, the spectators decided fate, as though thousands of voices could weigh a single soul. Imagine standing there, a gladiator battered and bleeding, straining to hear the will of the crowd, knowing your life hangs upon the fickle roar of strangers. The Colosseum could transform, too. Ingenious stagecraft allowed the arena to be flooded for mock naval battles, ships colliding in miniature seas under the Roman sun. Trapdoors released wild animals with sudden fury, as if the ground itself conspired against the contestants. It was a place of endless invention, where engineers and showmen worked hand in hand with emperors to maintain wonder. And yet, beneath the grandeur, there lingered shadows. The tunnels below, the hypogeum, were dark, cramped, and suffocating. Slaves hauled cages, prisoners waited their turn, animals roared in fear. While the crowd above roared with delight, those beneath the stage lived in dread. To step from those tunnels into the light was to face not only an enemy but the appetite of 50,000 souls, hungry for spectacle. By evening, when the last contest ended and the crowds drifted home, the arena was quiet again. The sand lay scarred, trampled, stained. Torches flickered in the tunnels, guiding weary workers through the tasks of cleaning, resetting, preparing for the next day's games. Even then, the Colosseum did not rest. It only paused, holding its breath until morning. Today, the Colosseum is hollow, its stones weathered, its tiers broken. Grass grows where once blood ran. Tourists wander with cameras, marveling at what remains. Few hear the echoes, but they are there. The rumble of applause, the clash of steel, the cries of animals long vanished. To stand within its arches is to feel the weight of humanity's contradictions. Our hunger for beauty, our thirst for violence, our endless fascination with watching others risk everything. But in the hush of night, the Colosseum becomes almost gentle. Moonlight slips across its arches, painting shadows upon shadows. It is no longer an arena of death, but a reminder of time's power to soften even the hardest of spectacles. The stones are cool, the air still, as though the city itself has finally grown tired. What was once thunder is now silence. What was once blood is now dust. So let the image settle in your mind. The vast oval, quiet beneath the stars, a place that once shook with the cries of thousands, now reduced to whispers carried on the Roman breeze. The Colosseum was built for spectacle, but tonight, it becomes a monument to stillness. And in that stillness, like a weary gladiator lowering his sword at last, you may feel yourself sinking gently into rest. If the Colosseum was Rome's theater of spectacle, then the baths were its theater of daily life. Not the quiet, private ritual we imagine today, not the quick shower before bed, not the solitary soak in a tub, but a grand social stage where thousands gathered each afternoon. For the Romans, bathing was not simply about washing away dirt. It was about belonging, about stepping into a world of marble, steam, and chatter, where the city itself seemed to breathe. Picture it. Late afternoon, the work of the day winding down, and streams of people drifting toward the thermae. Senators in flowing togas, merchants smelling faintly of olive oil and coin, laborers with dust still clinging to their sandals, slaves carrying bundles for their masters. All classes, all ages, all moods, funneling into the same doors. For though the empire was built on hierarchy, the baths leveled everyone, if only for a few hours. The greatest baths, like those of Caracalla or Diocletian, were vast as palaces. Entering them was like stepping into a city within a city. Courtyards stretched wide, fountains bubbled, statues of gods and heroes lined the walkways. The air hummed with voices. Vendors sold snacks, figs, honey cakes, roasted nuts. Philosophers argued in shaded corners. Children chased one another between columns. And all of it beneath vaulted ceilings so high they seemed to scrape the sky. But the baths were not a single room. They were a journey, a ritual, a slow movement through spaces designed to temper the body and soothe the spirit. First came the apoditerium, the changing room. Here, you stripped away not just your clothing but the weight of the outside world. Attendants kept watch over belongings, though theft was common enough that locks and tricks were invented to guard against sticky fingers. From there, the path unfolded like a story. Perhaps you would start in the palestra, an open courtyard for exercise. Men wrestled, threw balls, boxed beneath the sun, raising sweat before the real work of cleansing began. Imagine the thud of bodies on sand, the smack of leather gloves, the smell of exertion mixing with oil and dust. For Romans, sweat was not shameful. It was a prelude to renewal. Next, the tepidarium, a warm room, gentle as an embrace. The floor beneath your feet heated by hypocaust, an ingenious system of furnaces and air channels that made the very stones breathe warmth. Here, you lingered, letting your body adjust, pores softening, muscles loosening. The light was dim, filtered through small windows, the air heavy with vapor. Conversations drifted like the steam itself, slow and unhurried. Then the caldarium, the hot room. Entering was like stepping into the heart of the earth. The heat pressed against you, damp and insistent, sweat breaking instantly upon your brow. Pools of steaming water shimmered beneath the glow of oil lamps, their surfaces disturbed by the quiet movements of bathers sinking into the heat. Slaves carried buckets, poured water over glowing stones, stoked the furnaces below. Here voices hushed, the body surrendered. Afterward, relief, the frigidarium, the cold plunge. A pool of water so shockingly cold it seized the breath in your chest, forcing a gasp as you plunged beneath its surface. Muscles clenched, then released. Blood surged. To leave it was to feel reborn, the body tingling, alive. Romans praised it not only for refreshment but for health, believing it sealed the skin and strengthened the spirit. But bathing was never just physical. It was also social, perhaps more so. To the Romans, the baths were the heart of gossip, of politics, of schemes and friendships alike. Deals were struck in the tepidarium. Romances whispered in corners. Rivalries sharpened in the palestra. And always the presence of the emperor loomed. For to build a bathhouse was one of the surest ways for rulers to win love from the people. The baths of Caracalla, completed in the 3rd century, could hold thousands at once, a monument not only to cleanliness but to generosity. Bread and circuses may have fed the masses, but warm water and marble won their loyalty. Of course, it was not all elegance. The baths could be crowded, noisy, even unsanitary. Imagine hundreds of bodies pressed into the same pools, oil and sweat and perfumes swirling together. Roman cleansing did not rely on soap but on strigils, curved metal scrapers used to remove sweat and dirt. Attendants would rub you with olive oil, then scrape it away, leaving skin polished but the discarded mixture unpleasant. It gathered in jars, sometimes even sold for questionable uses. Not exactly the image of purity we might imagine. Yet still, there was beauty. The architecture of the baths was stunning. Vaulted ceilings painted with frescoes, mosaics of dolphins and tritons beneath your feet, statues of Apollo, Venus, Hercules watching silently as you bathed. Water itself was abundant, fed by aqueducts that carried streams from distant springs into the city, a marvel of engineering that allowed Rome to pour rivers into marble pools as casually as if they were endless. And so the baths became not just a place to cleanse, but a reflection of empire itself, opulent, crowded, ingenious, flawed, eternal. They were where old men reminisced, young men boasted, women gossiped, slaves whispered, where the lines between classes blurred in the steam, though never fully dissolved. Everyone entered the same waters, but everyone left with their own story. As the sun set and lamps were lit, the baths grew quieter. Families drifted home, muscles soft, minds eased. The marble cooled, shadows stretched long across the mosaics. Attendants swept the rooms, emptied the pools, stoked the fires for tomorrow. Outside, the city returned to its rhythms. Markets closing, taverns opening, the night beginning. Today, only ruins remain. Crumbling arches, shattered mosaics, weeds curling where fountains once spilled. But stand in the baths of Caracalla, and you can still imagine it. The echo of voices in vaulted halls, the soft splash of water, the scrape of strigils against skin. You can almost smell the oil, feel the press of heat, hear the murmur of conversations rising like mist. And then silence. The ruins at night are hushed, the marble cold under the stars. No laughter, no steam, no chatter. Only the wind slipping through arches, carrying memories like whispers. What was once alive with thousands is now a hollow shell, a monument not only to Roman genius but to the fleeting nature of all human gathering. Perhaps that is why the baths linger in the imagination. Not for the cleansing of skin, but for the way they gathered a city into one rhythm, one steam-filled breath. For a few hours each day, Rome exhaled together, and then dispersed again into its millions of stories. Let that image rest in your thoughts. Marble halls, warm water, steam curling softly in lamplight. The sound of voices fading into the evening, replaced by silence, by calm. A ritual of cleansing that belonged as much to the mind as the body. In that memory of steam and marble, you may find yourself drifting, the warmth of the caldarium becoming the weight of your blanket. The cool plunge no more than a sigh as sleep begins to pull you gently under. If empires are remembered by their ruins, then Rome is remembered by its roads. Not merely the broken arches of aqueducts, or the hushed echoes of amphitheaters, but the long, straight veins of stone that once carried the lifeblood of the empire. A road seems simple, even dull, yet it was on these unassuming stones that Rome rose, expanded, and endured. The Colosseum dazzled the crowds. The baths soothed them, but the roads held everything together, silent, reliable, unglamorous, and utterly essential. The Romans did not invent roads, but they perfected them, turned them into instruments of empire. Where earlier paths wound with the land, Roman roads cut across it with a stubborn straightness. To walk along one even today is to feel its logic, efficient, uncompromising, engineered not for beauty but for permanence. A road was a promise, that Rome could reach you wherever you were and quickly. Construction began not with stone, but with surveying. Roman engineers, armed with gromas and corybates, marked out the most direct route possible, often ignoring hills, rivers, or swamps that would have persuaded a lesser people to bend or detour. Rome did not bend. Rome built. When mountains rose, they carved into them. When marshes spread, they drained them. When rivers flowed, they spanned them with bridges. The land itself was reshaped to match Roman will, not the other way around. Once marked, the real work began. A trench was dug, layer upon layer filled. At the base, large stones, a foundation strong and unyielding. Above that, smaller stones and gravel compacted to stability. Then came sand, then lime, then finally the paving stones. Massive slabs fitted so tightly that even centuries later, weeds still struggled to creep between them. The roads crowned gently, allowing rain to run off into ditches. They were made to last not decades but ages. Some still carry traffic today, their surfaces worn smooth not by Roman sandals but by modern rubber tires. But the genius of Roman roads was not just their strength, but their scale. By the 2nd century CE, over 250,000 miles of road stretched across the empire, of which nearly 50,000 were stone-paved highways. To put that in perspective, enough to circle the earth 10 times. They radiated outward from the capital like spokes of a wheel, all leading to the Forum, all converging on the heart of power. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," was not poetic exaggeration. It was literal, and along those roads came everything. Soldiers marched in steady rhythm, their armor glinting in the sun, the iron of their hobnailed sandals sparking against stone. Merchants pushed carts laden with amphorae of wine, baskets of olives, bolts of silk from the east. Messengers carried tablets sealed with wax, racing with news of victories or rebellions. Ordinary travelers, two pilgrims, exiles, lovers, thieves. The roads bore them all without judgment, their stones indifferent to purpose. To walk the Via Appia, the Appian Way, was to feel this pulse most clearly. The Queen of Roads, it was called, stretching from Rome to Brindisi, a 1,000-year-old highway lined with tombs, villas, milestones. Even Cicero wrote letters from its inns, Even St. Paul traveled upon it. And still it lies there today, its paving stones uneven, its air heavy with memory. Yet roads were more than travel. They were conquest in stone. For when Rome built a road into your territory, it was not simply to connect you, it was to control you. A road meant legions could arrive swiftly, rebellions crushed before they began. It meant taxes could flow outward, grain and gold drawn like water along a canal. The road was Rome's leash, and once it lay across your land, you were tethered. Freedom became distance, and distance became impossible. And so Roman roads were lined not only with milestones but with power. Military camps sprung up at intervals, then towns, then colonies. Markets blossomed where travelers paused. Taverns too, offering wine, bread, perhaps companionship of the less reputable sort. Life spilled outward from the roads as surely as empire did. What began as military necessity became the very fabric of civilization. Still, the journey was not always comfortable. Roman carts had no suspension, only solid wheels that clattered mercilessly over stone. To ride in one for hours was to be shaken like grain in a sieve, every rut and bump a reminder that progress has its price. Dust rose in dry weather, mud splashed in wet. Robbers haunted the lonely stretches, though soldiers often patrolled. Inns varied wildly in quality. Some offered warm food and clean straw, others little more than sour wine and vermin. Travelers grumbled, cursed, endured, and kept moving, for the road allowed no excuses. Symbolism clung to the roads too. Funerary monuments lined them, families erecting tombs along the highways so that their dead would never be forgotten, so that each passerby might read a name, remember a life. In this way, the roads became not only arteries of empire, but corridors of memory. To travel was to pass the silent company of the dead, mile after mile. And when the empire fractured, when the legions withdrew and Rome itself grew frail, it was the roads that lingered. Kingdoms rose and fell upon them. Pilgrims walked them to holy shrines. Merchants carried salt, wool, spices. Medieval armies marched where legions once had. Even broken, even worn, the roads endured, for they had been built not just for Rome but for time itself. Stand today on a fragment of Roman road, and the world seems to stretch backward. The stones are uneven, polished by centuries of footsteps. Grass creeps along the edges, wildflowers bloom in the ditches. Cars may roar on nearby highways, but here there is only silence, the slow pulse of history beneath your feet. Place your hand on the stones, and you touch what legionaries touched, what merchants cursed, what emperors funded. It is not imagination but continuity. Perhaps that is why Roman roads linger in the mind. They are not as glamorous as temples, not as grand as amphitheaters, not as poetic as ruins tangled in ivy, but they are honest. They carried everything, glory and greed, laughter and lament. They remind us that civilization is not only built in marble halls, but in the steady rhythm of feet upon stone. As night falls, let the roads soften into thought. Imagine the sound of sandals on stone, the distant glint of a torch, the hum of voices fading into the dark. A road stretching forward endlessly, straight and sure, until the horizon blurs into nothing. You do not need to walk it. You only need to rest beside it, knowing it will carry the world forward while you drift gently into stillness. If Rome had a favorite lullaby, it was the sound of a crowd roaring for blood. Empires are rarely subtle, and Rome never pretended to be. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal quipped, were enough to pacify the masses, and nothing embodied that formula more spectacularly, or more brutally, than the gladiatorial games. They were theater, sport, ritual, and slaughter all in one. A curious mixture of discipline and chaos, of honor and degradation. In short, the perfect Roman pastime. The origins were somber rather than sensational. Gladiators began not as entertainers but as offerings. In the early Republic, funerary games honored the dead with ritual combat. The blood of men spilled to appease restless spirits. But Rome was never a city to let ritual remain dignified for long. The spectacle was too compelling, the audience too eager. What began as mourning evolved into entertainment, death repackaged as public amusement. By the late Republic, gladiators had become as much a fixture of Roman life as the baths or the Senate. To picture a gladiator, forget the cinematic glamour. Most were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. Freedom was rare, choice rarer still. They were bought, branded, and trained in gladiatorial schools called ludi. There, under the watchful eye of the lanista, part coach, part drill sergeant, part accountant, They learned the art of killing as performance. Wooden swords gave way to steel only after endless drills in footwork, shield angles, thrusts, feints. Strength mattered, but discipline mattered more. The crowd demanded skill, not mere frenzy. The gladiators were divided into types, each with its own armor, weapons, and fighting style. The murmillo, heavy with helmet and shield, plodding forward like a human wall. The retiarius, lightly armored, armed with net and trident, darting, elusive, almost mocking. The secutor, streamlined to chase down the net wielders, his helmet smooth and suffocating, allowing no snag. The Thracian, the hoplomachus, the Samnite, each a theatrical role, evoking Rome's conquered peoples, forcing men to reenact the humiliation of their homelands for Roman amusement. It was war turned into parody, defeat recycled into endless spectacle. The amphitheater was their stage, and none more imposing than the Colosseum. 50,000 souls packed into tiers of marble and stone, sun beating down on sand stained darker with each contest. The crowd was not quiet. It roared, chanted, jeered, demanded. Here, the Roman people were sovereign. Senators might posture in the curia, emperors might strut in purple, but in the arena, it was the crowd who ruled. Their thumbs turned up or down, though historians remind us the gesture was more complicated than Hollywood imagines, decided life or death. Yet it was not always a slaughterhouse. A gladiator was expensive. Months of training, armor, food, and housing represented significant investment. Killing them recklessly pleased the bloodthirsty but irritated the pragmatic. More often, fights were designed to prolong tension, to thrill the audience with near misses, reversals, dramatic recoveries. Death might come, but spectacle always came first. Some matches ended with both combatants alive, rewarded for their skill with palms of victory, perhaps even gold. Survival was not guaranteed, but neither was destruction inevitable. Still, make no mistake, blood was spilled. Wounds were celebrated, not hidden. The crowd wanted to see sweat, hear the clash of steel, watch the sand drink crimson. The games reminded Romans that life was cheap, that the empire itself was built on violence. And yet, paradoxically, the gladiator could become a celebrity. Names echoed in chants. Graffiti carved on walls proclaimed loyalty to particular fighters. Women swooned over scarred champions. In a society obsessed with status, the gladiator occupied a strange space. Despised as a slave, admired as a performer, feared as a killer, loved as a hero. The irony did not escape the Romans themselves. Philosophers like Seneca scorned the bloodlust, railing against the games as moral corruption. Man is most human, he wrote, when he forgets that he is mortal. But in the amphitheater, mortality was the main attraction. Here, the fragility of life was displayed, exaggerated, consumed. Rome watched and Rome cheered, because Rome was built on conquest, and conquest without blood was unthinkable. And then there were the beasts, exotic animals shipped from the far reaches of empire, lions from Africa, leopards from Asia, bears from the forests of the north. They were unleashed upon condemned criminals or hunted in orchestrated displays called venations. The logistics alone were staggering. Entire ecosystems were plundered to feed the Roman appetite for novelty. Whole species dwindled, their numbers torn from the wild so that they could die in an arena thousands of miles away to amuse an audience bored of swords and shields. Emperors too used the games as propaganda. Julius Caesar staged grand spectacles to curry favor. Augustus regulated them to project dignity. Nero used them as playgrounds for his vanity. But none surpassed the excess of Commodus, who fancied himself a gladiator, descending into the arena to fight not men but tethered animals, or hapless opponents too terrified to resist. His antics were less admired than endured, a reminder that when emperors played at gladiators, no one dared boo. Yet, for all their violence, the games were strangely structured, almost ritualistic. The procession of gladiators entering the arena, saluting the emperor with the famous words, "Those who are about to die salute you," though in truth, the phrase may have been rarer than we imagine. The match itself, the rules, the referees, the musicians playing in rhythm with the combat. It was death choreographed, ritualized, made digestible for mass consumption. And in rare cases, the gladiator could grasp freedom. A string of victories might earn a rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing release. To walk away from the arena alive, a free man, was the dream whispered in every barracks. Yet most never reached it. Most fought until their luck failed, until their bodies gave out, until the crowd grew restless. The sand remembered them even if Rome did not. Centuries later, when the games ended, when Christianity disapproved and economics made them impractical, the Colosseum fell silent. The sand no longer drank blood, the roars faded into birdsong, but the memory lingered. Gladiators became myth, legend, entertainment for a different age. Plays, paintings, novels, films, we still imagine them, half in horror, half in awe. We condemn the cruelty, yet retell the stories, unable to look away. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the gladiator. Not the broken bones or spilled blood, but the uncomfortable mirror they hold up to us. For though we no longer gather in amphitheaters to watch men kill one another for sport, our entertainment still thrives on violence. Only now it is pixelated, dramatized, staged on screens rather than sand. The Gladiator reminds us that Rome was not unique in its appetite. It was simply more honest. So close your eyes now, and let the roar of the crowd fade into the distance. Picture the sand, quiet at last, the weapons laid aside, the torches extinguished. The arena is empty, the shadows lengthen, the city hums beyond its walls. The gladiators are gone, their footsteps erased, their cheers and cries lost to time. What remains is silence. Imagine, for a moment, that your body is weary from a long Roman day. The sun has dipped low, the streets are still pulsing with the noise of merchants, carts, and the occasional drunken soldier, and you feel the weight of dust, sweat, and the Mediterranean heat pressing into your skin. In our modern world, you might picture a shower, a quick rinse under hot water, a neat towel, soap that smells faintly of lavender, and you're done. But in Rome, cleanliness was never so private, nor so simple. You would be expected to join the masses in one of the city's most important social institutions, the thermae or public bath. And when I say public, I mean very public. Forget your quiet, solitary bathroom. Imagine instead sharing your evening rinse with perhaps hundreds of other men, all undressing, sweating, and splashing in the same water, while debating politics or gossiping about the gladiatorial games. Privacy was for emperors. The rest of Rome's population bathed in company. The bathhouse was, to a Roman, what the internet is to us, a place of connection, chatter, and the occasional scandal. But the experience began not with warm water, but with ritual. You would enter the bathhouse, hand your clothes over to a slave or attendant, and prepare to be led through a sequence of rooms, each warmer than the last. The air would thicken with steam as you moved from the tepidarium, a pleasantly heated chamber, into the caldarium, where the heat hit you like a wall. Imagine sweat pouring from your body, your lungs filling with the dense moisture of burning wood and bubbling water, and the low hum of conversation echoing around the marble walls. Soap, as we know it, did not exist. Instead, Romans cleansed themselves with oil, olive oil, rubbed generously into the skin until it glistened. And then came the rather less glamorous part, scraping it all off again. A curved metal instrument called a strigil was drawn across the body, peeling away oil, sweat, and dirt in one sticky, greasy concoction. If you're imagining an exfoliating spa treatment, think again. It was neither gentle nor luxurious, but it was effective and, to a Roman, essential. Of course, one had to be wary. Bathhouses were notorious for petty theft. Your sandals, your tunic, your coin purse, all could vanish the moment you handed them over to the attendants. Poets often complained about it, warning readers to keep a sharp eye on their belongings or risk walking home in the nude. Yet the risk was worth it, for the bath was more than hygiene. It was theater. In the frigidarium, the cold plunge pool, you might see senators cooling themselves alongside freedmen, soldiers beside merchants, and philosophers with their students. Class distinctions blurred somewhat here, though not entirely. After all, some bathhouses had luxurious private sections for the elite, while the poor had to crowd into less glamorous establishments. Still, the communal act of bathing bound Romans together, and skipping it was almost unthinkable. But perhaps the strangest detail lies not in the water, but in the stories that bubbled around it. Bathhouses were notorious hubs of gossip. If you wanted to know who had fallen out of favor with the emperor, who was having an affair, or who had bribed whom, you would hear it first while sweating beside your neighbor in the caldarium. And while you relaxed, someone might be watching. Not every Roman came for the heat. Some came to ogle, to eavesdrop, to pickpocket, or to recruit accomplices in a political plot. For women, the experience was somewhat different. They too had baths, though often at separate times or entirely separate buildings. Roman writers, mostly men, were keen to imply that women's bathhouses were dens of vanity, where perfumes, cosmetics, and beauty rituals overshadowed the business of actual bathing. In truth, women valued them much as men did, for companionship, relaxation, and hygiene. Still, scandalous tales abounded, with certain moralists insisting that women in the baths were too free, too indulgent, too un-Roman, which of course meant that the baths, like so much in Rome, were yet another battleground of social judgment. Now, you might think this all sounds fairly civilized. After all, communal bathing has existed in many cultures. But let's pause and remember one detail. Water circulation and filtration were not what they are today. The warm, inviting pools were not necessarily drained daily. Hundreds of bodies, slick with oil, dust, and sweat, left their mark. The water could become cloudy, and the smell, though masked by incense or perfumed oils, was hardly the scent of mountain springs. Imagine submerging yourself into a soup of humanity, all for the sake of appearing polished and respectable in Roman society. And yet, the Romans adored it. Wealthy citizens even built private baths in their villas, replicating the public ritual in smaller form. Emperors, naturally, outdid everyone, constructing vast complexes of staggering size and splendor. The baths of Caracalla, for instance, could hold thousands of bathers at once, decorated with mosaics, towering columns, and gardens. These were monuments not just to hygiene, but to the empire's might. To step into them was to step into Rome's self-image as eternal, glorious, and orderly, even as pickpockets prowled the changing rooms. So, would you have enjoyed the Roman bath? Perhaps. The heat would relax your muscles, the oil would leave your skin soft, and the gossip might entertain. But you would also endure the scrape of the strigil, the ever-present fear of theft, the questionable hygiene, and the constant awareness that your body was on display. There was no such thing as a private soak in a Roman bathtub with candles and silence. In Rome, to bathe was to perform, to socialize, and to immerse yourself not just in water, but in the collective body of the empire. As you imagine drifting through those marble halls, steam rising like ghosts of the past, consider how different our own rituals of cleanliness are. We close the door, we turn a lock, we let hot water pour from unseen pipes, and we believe we are alone. In Rome, the bath was the opposite. Open, noisy, public, alive with voices, politics, and the steady scrape of metal against skin. To step into the thermae was to step into the empire itself, with all its grandeur, its mess, its contradictions, and its endlessly human need to wash away the dust of the day. And so, as the last echoes of splashing fade, and the marble walls grow cool, perhaps you too feel your body soften, as though you've sat for a while in the warmth of that ancient steam. A Roman evening, messy and communal, yet strangely soothing. Not a bath for solitude, but a bath for belonging. If you were to ask a Roman what kept their empire together, what force glued together its sprawling provinces, its restless citizens, and its fragile politics, you might expect an answer about military power, or law, or perhaps divine favor. And in truth, Rome had all of those. But the secret, whispered even by the satirists of the age, was far simpler: bread and circuses. It sounds almost ridiculous, doesn't it? The promise of food and entertainment, handed out regularly, was enough to keep millions of people from rioting. And it worked astonishingly well. In fact, if you had been transported into the bustling heart of Rome, you would quickly learn that survival did not always depend on loyalty to emperor or devotion to gods, but rather on your access to grain shipments and your ability to find a decent seat at the games. Let's start with the bread. Rome was enormous, far larger than its fragile local farmlands could possibly support. The city relied on grain imports, shipped across the Mediterranean, mostly from North Africa and Egypt. Massive fleets carried this lifeline of wheat into the harbors at Ostia, where it was carted along the Tiber to feed the capital's insatiable appetite. Grain was measured, stored, and distributed in dizzying quantity. At its height, over 150,000 Roman citizens received their allotments for free. Imagine lining up with your fellow Romans to collect your portion, stamped and approved, as essential to survival as the air you breathed. This grain dole was not charity, it was politics. Emperors understood perfectly well that a hungry mob was a dangerous mob. A steady stomach bought a steady city. And so long as the wheat ships kept arriving, the Roman people could endure almost anything: corruption, taxes, even emperors who were, shall we say, less than competent. But bread alone was not enough. After all, a full stomach still leaves plenty of time for mischief, resentment, or rebellion. And here entered the circuses, by which the Romans did not mean clowns and elephants under a tent, but rather the vast entertainments staged in arenas across the empire. Chariot races, gladiatorial combats, beast hunts, mock naval battles, spectacles so extravagant that even modern special effects would struggle to compete. The Circus Maximus, Rome's most famous racetrack, could seat more than 150,000 people at once. Imagine the roar of that crowd, the pounding of hooves, the whirl of dust as charioteers leaned dangerously into each turn. These races were not genteel affairs. Chariots crashed, drivers were trampled, and rival teams inspired passions so intense that fans brawled in the streets long after the finish. Supporting your favorite faction, red, blue, green, or white, was as consuming as any modern sports obsession. To skip a race was unthinkable. And then there were the gladiators. It's difficult, from the safe distance of centuries, to grasp the sheer popularity of men trained to fight, bleed, and die for entertainment. The amphitheaters were packed, not only with the poor but with senators and emperors themselves, all eager to watch men clash with steel, or with wild animals imported at staggering cost from Africa and beyond. Lions, leopards, bears, even elephants, paraded, starved, and then unleashed into sand already soaked with blood. It was theater, cruelty, and ritual all in one. For the crowd, the violence was exhilarating, a release from the daily grind of Roman life. For the rulers, it was insurance. So long as the people screamed for gladiators instead of justice, the empire endured. Critics complained, of course. Some philosophers wrung their hands at the bloodlust, others sneered at the manipulation. But the roar of the crowd drowned out their voices. Bread and circuses held firm. Even the emperors themselves sometimes played to the spectacle. Some entered the arena, at least symbolically, to show their courage. Others staged games of such absurd extravagance that chroniclers were left shaking their heads. Imagine whole naval battles fought in artificial lakes, thousands of men flailing in boats while spectators cheered from the banks, or exotic animals slaughtered in such numbers that species were driven toward extinction, all to amuse a restless crowd. To modern ears, it may sound grotesque, and it was, but it was also deeply Roman. The empire understood that its citizens did not live on ideals alone. They wanted bread, they wanted noise, distraction, and the chance to forget the sharp edges of life. And so the formula persisted: grain for the belly, spectacle for the eyes, and silence from the mob. Yet let us not be too quick to judge. Consider our own distractions, our own obsessions with entertainment. The forms have changed, but the principle remains hauntingly familiar. Politicians, then and now, know the value of keeping people entertained. The Roman mob had its amphitheater. We have our screens, our sports, our endless stream of content. The parallels are uncomfortably clear. Now imagine yourself there, seated on the worn stone of the Colosseum, the sun glaring overhead, the smell of dust, sweat, and blood heavy in the air. Around you, tens of thousands cheer as two men circle each other, swords glinting. A chariot crashes, a lion roars, the crowd surges with a kind of ecstasy. And for a moment, you are swept up in it too. This is not just cruelty. It is belonging. It is shared passion. It is the empire condensed into a single, thunderous roar. Would you have survived the bread and circuses? Likely yes, though perhaps reluctantly. You would have eaten the bread because hunger left no choice. You would have gone to the games because everyone did, because to refuse was to stand apart in a city where conformity meant safety. And though you might have flinched at the blood, you would also have cheered, perhaps against your will, carried along by the tide of thousands. Bread and circuses, simple words, but behind them the machinery of empire. Grain ships crossing the sea, beasts dragged from distant lands, men trained to fight, crowds whipped into frenzy, and rulers buying obedience with wheat and spectacle. All of it woven into a rhythm that lasted centuries. So when historians ask how Rome endured for so long, the answer might be as unromantic as this: feed the people, amuse them, and they will endure almost anything. Not law, not virtue, not divine favor, but bread and circuses. The glue of an empire, and perhaps the truest expression of what it means to rule. And as the crowd's roar slowly fades in your imagination, and the dust settles on the track, perhaps you feel the same gentle exhaustion the Romans did, their stomachs full, their minds dulled by spectacle, their grievances forgotten, for now. If you were suddenly transplanted into the Roman Empire, one of the first things you would notice, aside from the constant noise of carts, hawkers, and livestock, would be the baths. Not the kind you take at home, quietly and privately, but sprawling complexes of water, heat, and stone, where entire neighborhoods gathered daily to wash, gossip, and simply exist together. Roman baths were not luxuries for the few. They were public, cheap, and in many cases free. Emperors sponsored them as gestures of goodwill, and wealthy patrons funded them for prestige. To bathe was not merely hygiene, it was civic life, an obligation, almost a performance. If bread and circuses fed and distracted the city, the baths soothed and bound it. Picture one. Vast halls, their ceilings high and echoing, marble floors slick with water, mosaics underfoot, and steam rising in pale curtain. Pools shimmered in different temperatures, from icy cold plunges to scalding cauldrons. Furnaces roared below, tended by sweating slaves who shoveled wood day and night to keep the water piping hot. The engineering alone was remarkable. Aqueducts funneled water from miles away, pipes carried it into reservoirs, and clever hypocaust systems circulated heat beneath the floors. For a Roman, to skip the baths was unthinkable. The poet Martial once quipped that you could judge a man's health by whether he had made it to the Thermae that day. Old men went to soothe their bones, young men went to strut and preen, and everyone else went to talk. The baths were less about cleanliness. Soap was rare and often replaced by oil scraped off with strigils than about community. They were the empire's steam-filled forum, where business deals were struck, news spread, and scandals whispered. But of course, the experience was not always so serene. Imagine wading into a hot pool shoulder to shoulder with dozens, sometimes hundreds of others. The water was not drained daily. It was topped up, occasionally skimmed, but mostly left to stew. After all, aqueducts delivered abundance, but not infinity. And so you floated in what was effectively a human soup: oils, perfumes, sweat, the detritus of the city. A Roman nose was accustomed to odors we would find unbearable. And yet, this did not deter anyone. Quite the opposite. A visit to the baths was expected. Senators, merchants, soldiers, slaves, all passed through the same halls, often at different times of day, but under the same roof. Social divisions blurred slightly, if not erased. A poor man could at least recline in warm water like the rich, even if only for an hour. And in that hour, he belonged to Rome. The rhythm of the baths followed a set order. One began in the apoditerium, the changing room, where attendants, sometimes trustworthy, sometimes thieves, watched over your belongings. Then came the warm tepidarium to acclimate the body. From there, you moved into the caldarium, a chamber of scalding steam that opened pores and loosened muscles. Some endured this heat with bravado, sitting until drenched. Others hurried through, eager for the next stage, the frigidarium, a plunge into icy water that shocked the system and, supposedly, sealed in health. Some baths went further, offering massage rooms, libraries, gardens, even small theaters. You could spend hours wandering the halls, emerging pruned but refreshed, your mind as relaxed as your body. For women, separate times or spaces were usually set aside, though not without controversy. The mingling of sexes at certain baths scandalized moralists, who complained loudly but changed little. Naturally, the baths were also perfect stages for vanity. Young men displayed their physiques, greased with oil, posing like statues. Wealthy citizens arrived with entourages, flaunting slaves and perfumes. Even emperors appeared, sometimes ostentatiously. Titus, the builder of the Colosseum, also built great baths. Caracalla's bath complex sprawled so wide it could hold thousands at once. To build a bathhouse was to leave a monument of generosity carved in steam and stone. Yet there were dangers too. The baths could be political traps. Spies lingered, eavesdropping on careless tongues. Enemies could be met unexpectedly in the steam, leading to confrontations. And illnesses spread quickly in the moist, crowded air. Skin infections, parasites, and respiratory ailments flourished. Still, the Romans weighed these risks against the pleasures and chose to plunge in again and again. Perhaps the strangest detail for a modern visitor would be the cleaning method. Romans did not lather with soap, but instead smeared themselves in oil. After sweating in the caldarium, they scraped the oil off with a curved metal tool, the strigil, removing with it the dirt and dead skin. The mixture of oil, grime, and hair clumped together like wax, collected in jars, and sometimes even repurposed. Imagine a jar of what might politely be called Roman exfoliant, recycled, sold, perhaps used for lamp fuel. Nothing in Rome went entirely to waste. If this all sounds unappealing, consider how indispensable it was. The baths were not a place you visited reluctantly. They were where you lived part of your day. They were where you met friends, negotiated contracts, courted lovers, and presented yourself to society. To stay away too long was suspicious, almost antisocial. The bath was Rome's true melting pot, in every sense. Now close your eyes and picture yourself there. The roar of the furnace in the basement, the hiss of steam from vents in the walls, the chatter of dozens of voices bouncing off stone. A man passes, dripping, his strigil clinking in his hand. Children splash in the shallow pool. Somewhere nearby, a senator is whispering to a merchant, plotting business. And above it all, Sunlight filters through arched windows, catching on rising steam until the air itself glows golden. Would you have endured it? Likely yes. In the Roman world, the baths were less optional than food. You might have hesitated at the smell, the crowd, the questionable cleanliness. But you would have gone anyway, because not to go was to stand apart, and in Rome, standing apart was dangerous. Better to sweat, scrape, and plunge with the masses, emerging into the evening air cleansed in body, if not in spirit. And so the baths remind us of something essential. Rome was not only an empire of soldiers and emperors, it was an empire of daily rituals, where survival meant not just eating bread or watching circuses, but soaking in communal water until you felt Roman again. If you picture yourself dining in the Roman Empire, perhaps you imagine reclining on a couch, plucking grapes from a silver bowl while a servant fans you with peacock feathers. And yes, that image existed for a handful of wealthy elites who dined in villas or palaces. But for the vast majority of Romans, the diet was far simpler, sometimes alarmingly so, and often defined by monotony rather than decadence. The cornerstone of Roman food was not meat, not fish, not exotic fruits. It was bread. Grain was the lifeblood of the empire. The state itself organized grain imports from Egypt and North Africa, ensuring that the city of Rome could feed its million inhabitants. Without steady shipments of wheat across the Mediterranean, the empire risked riots. Politicians knew this well. Bread and circuses was not merely a phrase, it was policy. Bread filled stomachs, circuses distracted minds, and both prevented rebellion. But this bread was not the fluffy, fragrant loaf we know today. Roman bread was dense, dark, and often mixed with additives. Bakers sometimes stretched flour with ground beans, bran, or even sawdust when supplies ran low. Teeth of excavated Roman skeletons show heavy wear, not just from chewing, but from biting into bread filled with stone dust. Millstones shed grit into the flour, so every bite was a slow grinding against enamel. By Middle Age, many Romans had worn teeth and infected gums, not from sugar but from their daily loaf of bread. To wash it down, there was wine, but not in the way we know it. Roman wine was strong, sour, often unrefined. Drinking it neat was considered barbaric, something only Gauls and other uncivilized peoples did. Proper Romans diluted their wine with water, sometimes spiced it with herbs, honey, or even seawater. Yes, seawater. A salty tang was considered fashionable in certain vintages. If the wine soured, as it often did without preservation, it was not discarded but transformed into pasca, a cheap vinegar water drink popular with soldiers and the poor. Refreshing, they claimed. Medicinal, even. Meat, contrary to popular imagination, was scarce. Only the wealthy enjoyed frequent cuts of pork, beef, or lamb. The average Roman might see meat during festivals, when sacrificial animals were cooked and distributed, but on a normal day protein came from legumes, lentils, beans, and chickpeas. A Roman kitchen smelled not of roasting meat but of simmering pulses, seasoned with whatever herbs or salty sauces one could afford. And then, of course, there was garum, the legendary Roman fish sauce. Imagine vats of fish entrails left to ferment under the Mediterranean sun until they liquefied into a pungent, amber fluid. That fluid was then strained, bottled, and shipped across the empire at staggering volumes. Garum was sprinkled on everything: bread, beans, vegetables, even fruit. Think of ketchup, soy sauce, and Worcestershire combined, only sharper, smellier, and unavoidable. Entire coastal towns specialized in producing the sauce, their shorelines reeking for miles. For Romans, this was the taste of home. For us, it would be the taste of endurance. Vegetables filled out the diet, but not always the way we think of them. Cabbage was considered medicinal. Onions, leeks, and garlic were staples for the poor, flavoring otherwise bland porridge. Wealthy Romans prided themselves on exotic produce: dates from Judea, figs from Asia Minor, pomegranates from Carthage. Spices too. Pepper from India was the status symbol of the table, so precious that some claimed the spice trade drained the empire's wealth into the East one peppercorn at a time. For dessert, honey. Sugar was unknown to Rome, so sweetness came from bees. Honey-glazed pastries, candied nuts, and fruit stews. Rich families served elaborate sweet dishes, like pears stewed in wine with honey and spices, while the poor were lucky to taste a dab of honey once in a while. And yet, despite the empire's vastness, famine was never far away. Bad harvests, disrupted trade, or political turmoil could empty markets overnight. The very grain shipments that fed Rome were vulnerable to storms and piracy. A hungry city was a dangerous city, and emperors who failed to provide food often lost more than popularity. They lost their thrones. Still, food was never just sustenance. It was identity. To eat like a Roman meant bread, wine, and garum. To eat differently, to drink wine undiluted, to neglect bread, was to invite mockery as uncivilized. Even conquered peoples adapted quickly, absorbing Rome's diet as they absorbed its laws and language. Food was empire, edible and inescapable. Now imagine yourself at a Roman dinner, not in a palace, but in an ordinary insula, a cramped apartment block in the city. Dinner is a bowl of pulse, a porridge made of barley or spelt, thickened with beans and flavored with a drizzle of garum. A heel of bread sits nearby, tough but filling. Beside it, a cup of diluted wine, not luxurious but sufficient. This was not feasting, it was fuel. Enough to work another day, enough to avoid hunger's edge. Contrast this with the scene of the wealthy, the evening banquet. Reclining on couches, guests dined in multiple courses. Oysters, dormice stuffed with pork and pine nuts, roasted boar, exotic birds, fruits from distant provinces. Between dishes, poets recited verses, dancers performed, and slaves attended with napkins and perfumes. For these few, dining was theater. For everyone else, it was survival. Would you, transported back, have endured this diet? Perhaps. Bread and wine are still familiar. Beans and porridge still nourish. But the grit in the bread, the sourness of the wine, the omnipresence of fish sauce that might test your resolve. Imagine garum wafting through every street, soaked into every meal, until it lingered in your clothes and hair. To Romans, that was civilization. To you, it might be unbearable. And yet, like the baths, it was unavoidable. To eat Roman food was not just to stay alive. It was to be Roman. It was to partake in the empire's circulatory system, fed by fields in Africa, ships on the sea, mills in Ostia, ovens in Trastevere. Each bite was a reminder that Rome was not a city but a machine, and you were one of its cogs. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine the taste of ancient bread, dense, gritty, still warm from a communal oven. Picture a clay cup of watered wine, its scent sharp and sour. Drizzle fish sauce across your porridge in your mind, and remind yourself, this, more than marble columns or golden eagles, was the empire. Bread to eat, wine to drink, garum to endure. The Roman diet was not about pleasure. It was about belonging. When you think of Rome, perhaps you picture the Colosseum or marble temples or emperors in flowing togas. But if you asked a Roman what held their world together, they would not point to monuments. They would point to roads. Not glamorous, not artistic, but enduring. More than anything else, it was the roads that stitched the empire into one body. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," was not a poetic invention. It was, in many ways, a statement of geography. From the heart of the empire stretched an arterial network of stone, gravel, and packed earth, reaching across mountains, forests, and deserts. 29 great highways radiated from the capital like spokes on a wheel, with countless branches feeding into them. At its height, the system extended over 250,000 miles, 50,000 of them paved in stone. Long before trains, long before highways, this was the skeleton of Europe, and Rome built it. And these roads were not built carelessly. Roman engineers were practical, precise, and, above all, stubborn. A Roman road was expected to last centuries, and many still trace their way across modern landscapes today. Their construction followed a methodical pattern. First, surveyors marked the path, often choosing the straightest line possible, regardless of terrain. Mountains were not obstacles to be avoided. They were problems to be solved. If necessary, engineers cut tunnels, built switchbacks, or carved terraces into cliffs. Once the path was chosen, workers dug a trench, filled it with layers, large stones at the base, then gravel, then packed sand, then paving stones fitted together so tightly that grass could scarcely find a crack. Cambered surfaces allowed water to drain off the sides into ditches. Milestones, carved with distances and names of officials, punctuated the way like stone signposts. For soldiers marching in hobnailed sandals, for merchants leading donkeys, for officials carried in litters, these roads meant predictability. No matter where you went, the surface beneath your feet felt Roman. But what was it like to travel on them? Imagine yourself setting out from Rome, perhaps on the famous Via Appia, the Queen of Roads. Lined with tombs and monuments, it stretched straight as an arrow across the countryside. The sun beats down, carts creak, mules bray, and soldiers tramp in endless rhythm. Inns dot the roadside, offering food, drink, and a place to rest, though not always comfort. Fleas and straw mattresses were common companions. For the average traveler, speed was modest. A person on foot might cover 15 to 20 miles a day. A rider on a good horse could double that. But what mattered was reliability. Where other civilizations faced impassable mud in winter or rutted dust in summer, Rome's roads endured, allowing armies to move with unnerving efficiency. When rebellion flared, legions marched swiftly. When goods were needed, wagons rolled without delay. The empire's arteries pulsed constantly with movement. And then there was the cursus publicus, the imperial postal system. Couriers carried messages across the empire at remarkable speed, swapping horses at designated stations. A letter from the emperor could travel hundreds of miles in a matter of days, astonishing in a world without engines. News, orders, and decrees moved almost as fast as armies. To be connected to Rome was not just symbolic, it was logistical. But of course, the roads had another, darker function. They displayed power. The crucifixions along the Via Appia after Spartacus's rebellion were not hidden in alleys. They were set along the road, where every passerby could see the empire's vengeance nailed in wood and flesh. Roads were not only for transport, they were for demonstration. They said, "Here is Rome, efficient, eternal, and merciless." Yet, despite their magnificence, travel was rarely comfortable. Dust clung to tunics, blisters rose on feet, and accidents were frequent. Carts overturned, animals stumbled, bandits lurked in wooded stretches. Wealthy travelers often hired guards or traveled in groups, while the poor relied on luck. Roads connected, yes, but they also exposed. Once you left the safety of the city walls, you were at the mercy of weather, terrain, and strangers. Still, the system worked. It outlasted emperors, dynasties, even the empire itself. When Rome fell in the west, its roads remained, adopted by medieval kingdoms, repaved by modern nations, reborn as motorways. To this day, many European highways trace the exact lines first etched by Roman surveyors. Their stubborn straightness still defines landscapes, cutting through hills and forests with that ancient Roman disdain for detours. Would you, dropped into that world, manage the journey? Perhaps, but not without surprise. No roadside gas stations, no smooth asphalt, no air-conditioned respite. Instead, mile after mile of stone and dust, punctuated by rustic inns, stale bread, sour wine, and the occasional brawl. Travel was possible, even efficient, but never easy. You would have admired the roads, certainly, but you would also have cursed them beneath the same breath, just as countless Romans did. And yet, as night fell, you might have understood the genius. To walk a Roman road by moonlight, hearing the rhythm of sandals echo in the dark, was to feel the empire's presence under your feet. Every stone told you, you are part of something vast. Rome is here. Rome is everywhere. Rome is in the road itself. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine a straight line stretching across the horizon, vanishing into hills and valleys, marked by milestones and shadows. Hear the distant tramp of sandals, the creak of wooden wheels, the murmur of travelers. That is the lullaby of the empire. Not marble statues or triumphant speeches, but the steady heartbeat of stone beneath your steps. The Roman road, eternal, indifferent, enduring. If the Roman road was the empire's skeleton, then the games were its heartbeat, loud, rhythmic, and impossible to ignore. Rome was not merely a place of laws and legions, it was a place of spectacle. And nowhere did the empire reveal its contradictions more starkly than in the amphitheater. The Colosseum, or more formally the Flavian Amphitheater, was the crown jewel of this obsession. A stone giant rising from the heart of Rome, it could seat 50,000 people, perhaps more. Men, women, children, slaves, senators, and emperors all sat within its tiered ranks, divided by class but united by their hunger for spectacle. The poor packed into the higher levels, exposed to the sun. The wealthy sat close to the arena, fanned by servants. The emperor presided from his box, a figure both admired and feared. But what filled the arena was not noble theater. It was a theater of survival, carefully staged, meticulously orchestrated, and undeniably brutal. Gladiators, criminals, animals, each had their role to play. The crowd came not for subtlety, but for clarity. Life and death were laid bare, simplified into combat, into blood on sand. The gladiators themselves were not, as popular imagination sometimes paints, all heroic warriors. Many were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. Yet some chose the life voluntarily, lured by the promise of fame, wealth, or redemption. Trained in special schools, they lived under strict discipline, honing their bodies into weapons. There were types and categories: heavily armed murmillos with crested helmets and large shields, nimble retiarii with nets and tridents, towering secutors with smooth helmets designed to mimic predators. Each type was designed to fight another in a kind of bloody choreography, a balance of strengths and weaknesses. To the crowd, these distinctions mattered. A murmillo versus a retiarius was not random violence. It was a contest of style, almost a narrative. People cheered not only for victory, but for spectacle. How long the fight lasted, how skillfully blows were exchanged, how bravely a fighter faced death. A gladiator who fell might look to the emperor, who could signal mercy or execution with a flick of his hand. But it was not always so simple. Sometimes the crowd demanded a fighter be spared, admiring his courage. Other times they bayed for blood. In theory, the emperor held the power. In practice, the mob could sway him. And then there were the animals, exotic beasts, hauled from the far reaches of the empire, paraded into the arena to amaze and terrify. Lions from Africa, tigers from the east, elephants from India. For many Romans, these were the first glimpses of such creatures. They symbolized conquest, proof that Rome reached to the ends of the earth. But their role was not merely decorative. They fought gladiators or each other or unarmed prisoners. To modern eyes it seems savage, but to the Roman crowd, it was awe-inspiring. The animals represented both nature's majesty and Rome's ability to dominate it. Beyond combat, the games included elaborate reenactments. Naval battles, naumachii, were staged in flooded arenas, with ships clashing before roaring spectators. Historical battles were recreated, often with thousands of participants. Even myths were brought to life, with unlucky prisoners cast as characters destined to die gruesomely. The line between entertainment and execution blurred until they were indistinguishable. And yet, amid the blood, there was order. These were not riots but spectacles, organized with astonishing precision. The amphitheater itself was a marvel. Efficient entrances and exits, shaded awnings, trapdoors, elevators to raise beasts and fighters from underground chambers. Roman engineering ensured that the chaos remained contained, that the violence unfolded according to schedule. It was, in a way, a mirror of the empire, brutal, orderly, spectacular. For the common people, the games were more than diversion. They were relief. Rome was crowded, noisy, unequal. Poverty pressed heavily on the masses. The government knew this, and the games, along with free grain, the famous bread and circuses, were tools to soothe discontent. Give the people food, give them spectacle, and they would not question the system too closely. The amphitheater was not simply entertainment, it was politics. Each roar of the crowd was a reminder of who ruled, and why. Would you, a visitor from the present, survive such a spectacle? Perhaps physically, yes, you could sit in the stands, shield your eyes when the blood sprayed, cheer when others did. But inwardly, it would jar you. The casualness of it, the way children laughed while men died, the way women waved scarves for their favorite fighters, it would feel dissonant, almost surreal. Romans did not see what you would see. To them, the games were not cruelty. They were community, identity, celebration of strength. The suffering in the arena was transmuted into something larger than life. And yet, not all Romans approved. Philosophers like Seneca and Cicero criticized the excess, arguing that constant exposure to blood cheapened the soul. Early Christians condemned the games as immoral, though many of them, too, could not resist the pull of spectacle. Even emperors occasionally recoiled. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, supposedly read philosophy to distract himself during the games, as if the stoic words of Epictetus might shield him from the crowd's frenzy. But the games endured for centuries. They evolved, expanded, and only faded when the empire itself waned, when resources grew scarce and priorities shifted. Even then, the shadow of the amphitheater lingered, a reminder of a time when the empire kept its people amused with bread and blood. And so, as you drift now toward rest, imagine the roar of 50,000 voices echoing in stone. The sand beneath your feet is stained, but the crowd does not notice. They cheer, they gasp, they chant for mercy, for death, for spectacle. Above it all, the emperor's hand hovers, a tiny gesture holding the weight of life itself. This was Rome at play, terrible, mesmerizing, unforgettable. If the Roman games were a thunderous display of collective energy, then leisure was their counterpoint, a quieter, though no less calculated, expression of Roman life. For while Rome gloried in conquest and spectacle, it also gloried in relaxation. And nowhere did the empire reveal its softer, stranger side than in the ways its people passed their idle hours. Let us begin with the bathhouse. To call it a bathhouse is almost misleading because one imagines a simple place to wash, a utilitarian hall with basins of water. But Roman baths were more than cleansing. They were architecture, community, ritual. Every city of size, every settlement of consequence, boasted its own complex of baths. To step inside was to enter a world dedicated to the art of comfort. The sequence followed a rhythm. First the apodyterium, the changing room, where clothing was shed, placed in niches, or entrusted to slaves who hopefully did not wander off with it. Then the warm room, the tepidarium, to ease the body into the experience. Next the hot chamber, the caldarium, with its steamy air, heated floors, and scalding pools. And finally, the cold plunge, the frigidarium, a shock to the senses that left one refreshed, tingling, alive. All of it was powered by Roman engineering, hypocaust systems that channeled heat under floors and through walls, keeping water warm and air heavy with steam. But baths were not about bathing alone. They were social centers. Men, women, and children gathered not just to wash but to gossip, scheme, and pass time. Merchants struck deals. Politicians whispered alliances. Philosophers debated. Friends lingered in the gymnasium attached to the bathhouse, lifting weights or throwing a discus before soaking in hot water. Even food and drink circulated. Massage rooms offered oils and scrapers, strigils, to scrape away sweat and dust. The bath was not a private indulgence but a public ritual, accessible to rich and poor alike. For a small fee, or sometimes none at all, one could spend the day drifting between heat and cold, conversation and rest. Imagine yourself there, the air thick with steam, the echoes of laughter, arguments, splashing, the smell of oil and sweat and hot stone. You would stand out, perhaps, not for your body but for your unease. For to a Roman, nudity in the baths was natural, unremarkable. To you, it would feel exposed, a stripping not just of clothes but of defenses. The bath demanded a certain surrender. From the baths, we moved to the banquet, another pillar of Roman leisure. To dine in Rome was not merely to eat. It was to perform, to display wealth, to demonstrate taste. The poor ate quickly, simply bread, porridge, olives, cheese. But the wealthy reclined in dining rooms, the triclinia, on couches arranged around low tables. They feasted not only on food but on display. Courses came in waves. First the appetizers, eggs, salads, shellfish. Then the main dishes, elaborate and strange to modern palates. Dormice stuffed with herbs and nuts. Flamingo tongues, prized for their rarity. Fish sauces, garum, poured over almost everything, pungent, fermented, omnipresent. And then the desserts, honey cakes, fruits, nuts, wine spiced and warmed. Between courses, entertainment might be provided. Musicians, dancers, poets, even acrobats. To recline while eating was itself a symbol, a declaration that one had the leisure to lie down while others served. Slaves hovered with trays, with water, with towels. Conversation flowed, politics, philosophy, gossip, laughter. The meal could stretch for hours, long into the evening. It was not about hunger but about display, about time luxuriantly wasted. Of course, there were excesses. Roman writers themselves mocked the gluttony of the rich, the way some hosts bankrupted themselves trying to outdo each other in extravagance. Satirists sneered at men who devoured oysters by the dozen or served peacocks merely to impress. Yet beneath the mockery lay truth. Dining was a performance, as much about being seen as about eating. Beyond baths and banquets lay gardens, villas, spaces designed for odium, the Roman word for leisure, which implied not idleness but a cultivated, structured rest. To the wealthy, odium was a philosophy. Villas outside the city offered a retreat from noise, with colonnades, fountains, shaded walks. There, one might read poetry, write letters, stroll among statues, or simply sit, listening to the hum of cicadas. Leisure was not laziness, it was refinement. A Roman gentleman, after all, was expected to balance odium with negotium, leisure with business, retreat with duty. Even the streets offered moments of idleness. Markets bustled with chatter. Children played with nuts, balls, hoops. Dice rattled on tavern tables, where gamblers argued over stakes. Actors performed in open squares. Festivals punctuated the calendar. each bringing parades, music, sacrifices, firelit celebrations. Rome did not lack for spectacle, both formal and casual. To us, these rituals of rest might seem enviable. Who would not wish for long afternoons in hot baths, evenings reclining at endless dinners, mornings strolling through shaded gardens? Yet to live them as Romans did would unsettle you. The baths crowded and noisy, without privacy. The food strange, over-seasoned, often excessive. The banquets laced with obligation, a web of power and performance. Leisure in Rome was not individual. It was communal, structured, and public. There was no quiet retreat behind locked doors, no private indulgence free from scrutiny. To rest was still, in some sense, to perform, and so you would endure if not enjoy. You would feel refreshed by the baths, but disoriented by the openness. You would marvel at the feasts, but long for simpler bread. You would admire the gardens, but find them tinged with expectation. Rome allowed leisure, but it did not allow escape. Even idleness served the empire. As night falls, imagine the city after its day of rest. Steam drifts from the rooftops of bathhouses. The laughter of dinner parties echoes through colonnaded courtyards. Lanterns flicker in gardens where philosophers pace in thought. And in the taverns, dice continue to clatter, as voices rise in argument and song. This was leisure in Rome, structured, strange, and never entirely free. If Rome was built on stone and conquest, it was held together by something less tangible: ritual. To live as a Roman was not merely to obey laws or pay taxes. It was to participate in an unending choreography of worship. Religion was not private, not hidden in quiet corners of the soul. It was everywhere, inscribed in walls, etched into daily gestures, woven into the simplest acts of survival. The Roman world was thick with gods. Some were vast, cosmic, almost terrifying in their scale. Jupiter, king of the sky, thunderer and guardian of oaths. Mars, crimson with the blood of battle, impatient, demanding. Venus, glowing with beauty and desire. Others were humbler, quieter, yet no less insistent. The Laras and Penates, household spirits, invisible guardians of hearth and pantry. The genius, a spirit unique to every man, woman, or place. Every bridge, every field, every doorway seemed to have a deity watching, waiting, requiring a nod, a gift, a drop of wine poured upon the earth. To walk through Rome was to move through a forest of shrines. Temples stood tall, white marble against the sun. Altars glowed with ash. Statues gleamed with the oil of offerings. Even at home, each family kept its lararium, a small household shrine, often decorated with painted figures, little gods watching over bread and salt. Before meals, a morsel was offered to them. Before journeys, a prayer was whispered. Religion was not a Sunday obligation. It was a constant hum beneath life, a background rhythm no one dared to ignore. Public ritual was spectacle. Priests, clad in togas with heads veiled, leading animals to sacrifice. The bleating of sheep, the bellowing of oxen, silenced by the blade. Blood steaming on altars, smoke rising toward indifferent skies. The entrails inspected, read like a book, to see whether the gods approved. And if they did not, if the liver was blemished, if the omens were wrong, the sacrifice was done again. Nothing could proceed without divine permission. A battle, a law, even a wedding. Every act of importance passed first through the silent judgment of gods. But not all faith was lofty. Some of it was ordinary, almost superstitious. Amulets were worn against the evil eye. Charms were buried in thresholds. Children wore little pendants to protect them from curses. The boundary between religion and magic was thin, blurred, often crossed. In the bustling streets, you might find a seller of charms offering whispered formulas, promising luck, health, love. Rome, for all its grandeur, was also deeply anxious, convinced that unseen forces pressed close at every moment. Festivals punctuated the calendar with almost reckless abundance. The Saturnalia, wild with reversals, when masters served slaves, and gambling and laughter filled the air. The Lupercalia, half sacred, half scandalous, with young men running through streets, striking bystanders with strips of goat hide, a ritual said to bring fertility. Each month, each season, brought some new occasion to feast, to sacrifice, to remind the people that Rome was favored because Rome remembered its gods. You, wandering into this world, would find no room for disbelief. To admit doubt would mark you not as enlightened, but as dangerous. The gods were not ideas to be debated. They were facts woven into roads, walls, markets, bread. Even the emperor himself was not merely a ruler, but eventually a god in flesh. To resist that was not philosophy, it was treason. And yet, beneath the weight of official ritual, there pulsed something more personal. Mystery cults crept through Rome, offering private salvation, secret rites. The cult of Isis, imported from Egypt, whispering promises of rebirth. The cult of Mithras, beloved by soldiers, gathering in hidden caves to dine on sacred meals. These faiths asked for more than offerings. They asked for loyalty, devotion, transformation. They promised not just prosperity in this world, but something beyond, an afterlife worth longing for. It is here you might feel closest to your own time, standing in shadowed rooms, holding a flickering lamp, hearing hymns whispered in languages half foreign. The desire for meaning beyond the visible world, the hope for life after death, these were longings no empire could crush. But even with this diversity, religion remained inescapably public. Before business, before war, before leisure, there were rituals. Omens read in the flight of birds. Sacrifices repeated until favorable signs appeared. Silence demanded at sacred moments, the crowd holding its breath as the priest lifted his hands. To be Roman was not merely to believe, but to participate. To skip the rites, to neglect the gods, was to invite disaster not just upon oneself, but upon the whole community. Imagine waking in your insula apartment. You stretch, rise, and before you take bread, you sprinkle a few crumbs at the family shrine. Before you leave for the market, you mutter a prayer to the household gods, asking that thieves and illness stay far. On the street, you pass a shrine to Jupiter, toss in a coin, nod to the statue. At midday, you hear the bells of sacrifice echoing from the forum. Smoke curls upward, the scent of burning flesh drifting over the rooftops, and you feel, without question, that this is how the world must be. In such a world, disbelief was not rebellion. It was unthinkable. To be Roman was to share the rituals, whether or not your heart burned with faith. It was less about theology than about belonging. To refuse was to stand apart. To stand apart was dangerous, so you would kneel whether convinced or not. You would scatter the salt, pour the wine, murmur the words, and perhaps, in time, the rhythm of it would wear away your hesitation. Perhaps you would feel, as the crowd did, that unseen forces were watching, judging, guiding. Or perhaps you would always feel the strangeness of it, the weight of 1,000 eyes, human and divine, measuring every gesture. Rome was vast, iron-willed, relentless in its demand for loyalty. But its power did not rest only in armies or laws. It rested in ritual, in the small gestures repeated endlessly, day after day, generation after generation, until they seemed not chosen but inevitable. To live in Rome was to live in a web of gods, their hands on every door, their shadows in every street. And so, in the fading light, as torches flicker in the forum and the last smoke of sacrifice drifts into the sky, you realize something unsettling. You could survive Rome's heat, its crowds, its baths, its banquets. But you could not survive its gods, not because they are real or unreal, but because in Rome, belief was not a choice. It was the air. By now, you have walked through the streets of Rome, felt its stones underfoot, smelled its kitchens, heard its markets. You have lingered in its baths, sweated in its heat, tried to sleep through its noise. You have watched its games, survived its feasts, endured its laws, and bowed before its gods. And perhaps, in these wanderings, you have begun to see why a single day in this empire might undo you. It is not that Rome was a world of cruelty only. It was also a world of grandeur, of astonishing endurance, of beauty carved into marble, of aqueducts leaping across valleys, of roads that stitched continents together. It was, in many ways, brilliant beyond measure. And yet brilliance is not comfort. Brilliance does not soften stone floors, does not sweeten sour wine, does not make crowded apartments more spacious, or laws less unforgiving. The ordinary Roman day began earlier than yours. Dawn was not a gentle easing in, but a command. The streets came alive before the sun had fully risen, with shouts of vendors, the creak of carts, the clatter of sandals on stone. There was little silence, almost no solitude. Even in sleep, you were never alone. The walls were thin, the city dense. Privacy was a dream Rome did not sell. You, used to doors that closed tightly and windows that shield you from sound, would find the constant hum unbearable. And then the food. Rome's banquets dazzled, yes, but they were rare, reserved for the wealthy. Your daily bread, unless you were one of the few, would be coarse, dark, sometimes moldy. Wine was sour, cut with water, sometimes with herbs or honey to disguise its flaws. Meat, a rarity. Fish, salted to the point of bitterness. Olive oil, thick and smoky. You would survive, certainly, but it would never be what you imagine when you picture Mediterranean abundance. And your stomach, accustomed to refrigeration, pasteurization, and hygiene, would rebel more quickly than you think. Then the baths. Glorious, yes, grand halls of steam and water, mosaics glittering beneath light. But also crowded, noisy, and sometimes less clean than you wish. Water carried diseases as easily as it soothed muscle. Communal basins were not sterilized, not chlorinated. What feels to you like luxury might, after days, become hazard. And yet, to refuse the baths was to refuse Rome itself. They were not merely places to wash. They were places to live, to gossip, to deal, to belong. You would go because all Romans went. The laws, too, would trip you. Rome was proud of its order, but its justice was not yours. Slavery was not a moral debate, but an assumption. Class was not a background detail, but the air itself. Your worth was written in your name, your toga, your rank. To be poor was not simply to have less. It was to be less. The idea of rights as you know them, universal, equal, guaranteed, would sound absurd in the forum. And you, insisting upon them, would find yourself not respected but ignored, perhaps even punished. And then the religion. You would stumble most here, not because the gods are too strange, but because disbelief is too easy for you. In Rome, the gods were not ideas. They were obligations. Sacrifices were not optional. Rituals were not cultural curiosities. They were lifelines, securing Rome's favor, Rome's future. To refuse was to risk the city itself. Your modern insistence on private faith, on conscience, on freedom, would sound not noble but dangerous. You would bow or you would be broken. Even leisure would test you. The games in the Colosseum, so often romanticized as thrilling, were spectacles of death. To watch men kill one another, animals tear flesh, bodies dragged across sand. This was not horror for Romans. It was entertainment, tradition, glory. Your stomach might turn. Your eyes might close, but theirs would not. To them, the blood was not cruelty. It was Rome's power displayed, Rome's order maintained, Rome's gods appeased. To flinch would mark you as soft, strange, foreign. And still, beyond all of this, there was the sheer pace of the city. Rome did not pause. It did not yield. Crowds pressed, noise surged, heat swelled. At every corner, some new demand. A prayer, a tax, a transaction, a performance of belonging. A single day was a relentless tide, carrying you forward whether you wished or not. By dusk, your body would ache, your mind would reel, your spirit would sag. And yet, for Romans, this was not burden but life. That is the heart of it. Rome was not unbearable because it was crueler than your world. It was unbearable because it was not yours. Your habits, your comforts, your ideas about self and freedom and time, they would all find no soil here. You would not starve. You would not fall at once to disease. You might even marvel, for a moment, at the brilliance of it all. The shining temples, the echoing baths, the sudden opening of a forum alive with voices. But by the close of that single day, as torches flickered and shadows stretched, you would feel the exhaustion not of the body but of the soul. Because Rome asked more than you could give. It asked for obedience, for participation, for silence at its sacred moments, for cheers at its brutal games. It asked you to accept the gods without question, the laws without protest, the hierarchy without rebellion. It asked you not simply to live, but to live as Roman. And that, perhaps, is why you would not last. Not because Rome was unlivable, but because Rome was too fully itself. And so, as night falls on the eternal city, you retreat to your narrow bed in a crowded apartment, the air thick with heat and smoke, the noise of the streets still humming through the thin walls. You lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how these people endured, how they not only endured but built, conquered, celebrated, prayed, and thrived. And then you realize they did not survive Rome by resisting it. They survived by dissolving into it, by letting it shape every gesture, every word, every breath. But you are not Roman. You never will be. And so Rome, for all its brilliance, would swallow you whole before the day was done. And that, perhaps, is the quiet answer to the question we began with. Why you would not last a day. Not because Rome was too brutal or too strange or too distant, but because Rome belonged entirely to itself. And you, wandering in from another world, another time, could never truly belong.